The Byzantine camp stirred before dawn, but it did not stir with the confidence of an army that owned the ground beneath it. It stirred with the nervous, twitching energy of a body that has not truly slept, that has spent the hours of darkness listening for sounds that may or may not have been there, interpreting every crack of a branch and every rustle of undergrowth as the prelude to an attack that never came but that was always, always about to come. The sentries who had walked the perimeter through the night were hollow-eyed and jumpy, their hands tight on their spears, their necks sore from the constant swiveling of heads that had become their unconscious response to the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, men with swords and bows were watching them with the patient, calculating attention of predators, assessing the moment to strike. Evranosh had not attacked during the night. The decision to refrain was deliberate and strategic, and it was based on a principle that he had learned not from any manual of warfare but from years of observation and experience, the principle that the threat of violence is often more effective than violence itself, because violence spends its force in a single moment, but the threat of violence can be sustained indefinitely, and the psychological cost of sustained threat, the drain on morale, the erosion of sleep. The slow accumulation of fear that transforms confident soldiers into nervous wrecks is a weapon that requires no ammunition and produces no casualties among those who wield it. By choosing not to attack, Evranosh had ensured that the Byzantine camp spent the entire night preparing for an attack that never materialized, and the energy consumed by that preparation, the hours of watchfulness, the tension in every muscle, the adrenaline dumped into bloodstreams that had nowhere to direct it, was energy that would not be available for the march that would begin at dawn. He watched the camp from his position on the ridge, as the first grey light of morning began to seep through the trees, and he noted the sluggishness with which the soldiers emerged from their tents, the slow, heavy movements of men who had not rested, the irritable exchanges between officers who were feeling the pressure of command without the compensating clarity that comes from adequate sleep. He noted that the cavalry horses were being saddled, but that several of them were showing signs of fatigue, their heads hanging low, their movements listless, the result of being kept bridled and ready throughout the night in case of a sudden deployment that had never been ordered. And he noted that the baggage train, or what remained of it after the previous day's raid, was being assembled with exaggerated caution. The surviving wagons clustered so tightly together that they impeded each other's movement. The escort tripled in size, the entire rear of the column now devoted to the protection of supplies rather than the advancement of the army. This was exactly what Evranosh wanted to see, because an army that devotes a disproportionate share of its strength to protecting its supplies is an army that has been psychologically wounded, an army that is thinking about what it might lose rather than what it might gain, and an army in that mindset fights differently from one that is focused on victory. It fights cautiously, defensively, reactively, always a beat behind the tempo of events, always responding to the last threat rather than anticipating the next one, and this reactive posture creates openings that a skilled and aggressive opponent can exploit. He sent a rider back to Bursa with a detailed report of the night's observations and the morning's developments, and the report included not just the military intelligence that Turhan would need to update his defensive plans, but also Evranosh's own assessment of the Byzantine army's state of mind, because morale is as much a factor in warfare as numbers or equipment, and an enemy who is tired and nervous and starting to doubt the wisdom of his campaign is an enemy who is already half defeated. The rider departed at a gallop, the horse fresh and eager after a night of rest, and the sound of its hooves faded quickly into the forest, absorbed by the trees and the damp morning air, and Evranosh turned his attention back to the Byzantine camp and began planning the day's operations, because the pressure must be maintained, the harassment must continue, the slow, grinding, relentless erosion of the Shahanshah's confidence and capability must proceed without pause. Because every hour bought was an hour earned, and the currency of time was the most valuable resource in Orhan Sahib's treasury. Far to the north, in the Karasi territory, the sun rose over a landscape that was deceptively peaceful, rolling hills covered with brown winter grass, scattered clusters of bare trees, whose branches traced intricate patterns against the pale sky, small villages nestled in valleys, where thin plumes of smoke rose from hearth fires, and the sound of livestock carried across the still morning air. It was the kind of landscape that painters love and soldiers fear, because its beauty conceals its dangers the way a calm sea conceals its currents, and the man who relaxes in such a landscape is a man who has forgotten that beauty and danger are not mutually exclusive, but are often found in precisely the same place at precisely the same time. Koroglu had begun his work. He had risen before dawn and had spent the early morning hours visiting 3 men who lived within an hour's ride of his village, men whose positions within the Karasi military structure gave them influence over small but significant groups of soldiers, and whose private doubts about Damir Khan's leadership he had confirmed through careful, indirect conversation during the months preceding Darsan's visit. These visits were conducted with a casualness that was entirely artificial, Koroglu arriving at each man's home, with the easy, unhurried demeanor of a neighbor dropping by to share a cup of tea and discuss the weather, the livestock, the price of grain, the mundane concerns of rural life that provided a perfectly natural cover for the real conversation that would take place once the tea was poured, and the doors were closed, and the children were sent outside to play. The first man he visited was called Arslan, a company commander whose soldiers were stationed at a small outpost on the road between the Karasi heartland and the Byzantine frontier. Arslan was a man of middle years, thick-bodied and slow-moving, with the kind of face that seems incapable of deception because every thought he has is written across it in letters large enough to read from across a room. Koroglu had known him for 15 years, had fought beside him in 3 campaigns, and had watched the gradual transformation of his demeanor from the confident, aggressive energy of a soldier who believes in his cause to the sullen, withdrawn quietness of a man who has started to question everything he once took for granted. Koroglu did not approach the subject directly. He sat in Arslan's kitchen and drank tea and talked about the winter harvest and the condition of the roads and the health of Arslan's aging mother, and he waited, because a man who has something on his mind will eventually bring it to the surface if you give him enough silence to fill. And Arslan's silence was the loaded, pregnant silence of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask the questions he could not ask himself. It was Arslan who brought up the alliance. He said it casually, almost offhandedly, the way a man mentions a pain in his side that he has been ignoring for months, but that has become too persistent to pretend away. He said that the soldiers at his outpost had been asking questions about why they were taking orders from Byzantine officers, questions about why Karasi warriors were being deployed alongside men who wore the cross and prayed to a different god, questions that Arslan had answered with the standard responses of discipline and duty, but that he could no longer answer with conviction because the responses no longer felt true. Koroglu listened and nodded and said nothing for a long moment, and then he leaned forward and lowered his voice and told Arslan about Darsan's visit, about the conversation they had shared, about the possibility of a different path, a path that led not toward the Byzantine alliance but away from it, toward an alignment with the Ottoman cause that offered not just military advantage but moral clarity, the assurance that the fight they were fighting was a fight worth fighting. Fought for reasons that a man could explain to his children without shame. Arslan's reaction was not immediate acceptance but cautious hope, the reaction of a man who has been shown a door in a wall he had believed to be solid, a door that might lead to freedom or might lead to a trap, and who needs time to examine the door before deciding whether to step through it. He asked questions, practical questions about what would happen to his soldiers if they defected, about how they would be treated by the Ottomans, about whether their families would be protected from Damir Khan's retribution, and Koroglu answered as honestly as he could, acknowledging the risks without minimizing them, offering assurances without making promises he could not keep, and the honesty of his answers was itself a form of persuasion. Because a man who lies to you about the risks of a venture is a man who does not respect you enough to trust you with the truth, and Arslan was too experienced and too proud to follow a man who did not respect him. The conversation lasted 2 hours, and when it was over, Arslan had not committed to anything specific, but had agreed to think about what Koroglu had said, and to sound out certain men within his company whose loyalty he trusted and whose doubts he had sensed. He shook Koroglu's hand with the firm, lingering grip of a man who is sealing not a contract but an understanding, and Koroglu rode away from the house with the careful optimism of a man who has planted a seed in good soil and must now wait to see whether it takes root. The second visit was to a man named Selim, a logistics officer whose job was managing the supply chains that kept the Karasi military fed and equipped, and whose position gave him a comprehensive view of the territory's military posture that few others possessed. Selim was different from Arslan, younger, sharper, more analytical, the kind of man who saw the world not in terms of loyalty and honor, but in terms of systems and efficiencies, and whose disillusionment with Damir Khan was rooted not in moral objection, but in the professional assessment that the alliance with Byzantium was strategically unsound, that it committed the Karasi to a conflict they could not win, that it exposed their supply lines to interdiction, that it divided their forces between 2 fronts without the resources to sustain operations on either, and that the eventual outcome, regardless of whether the Ottomans were defeated, would be the absorption of the Karasi into the Byzantine sphere of influence, a result that served the Shahanshah's interests but not the Karasi's. Koroglu approached Selim differently than he had approached Arslan, because the arguments that work on a man of feeling do not always work on a man of calculation, and vice versa. He presented the case for defection not in terms of principle or honor, but in terms of interest, strategic interest, economic interest, the cold, hard mathematics of survival that Selim's mind was trained to process and evaluate. He laid out the numbers, the relative strength of the Ottoman and Byzantine forces, the vulnerability of the Karasi position, the likelihood of various outcomes, and he let the numbers speak for themselves, because numbers do not lie and they do not flatter, and Selim was a man who trusted numbers the way Arslan trusted his gut. Selim listened with the focused attention of a man hearing a proposal that confirms his own analysis, and when Koroglu had finished, Selim did something that Arslan had not done. He asked about Darsan specifically, about the young man's capabilities, his character, his potential as a leader, and the questions were not idle curiosity but the evaluation of an investment, because Selim understood that defection was meaningless without a viable alternative, and a viable alternative required a leader who was capable of commanding loyalty and making decisions under pressure, and Darsan was the candidate being offered for this role. And Selim needed to be satisfied that the candidate was worthy before he would commit his resources and his reputation. Koroglu spoke honestly about Darsan, acknowledging his youth and his relative inexperience while emphasizing his intelligence, his courage, his willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for principle, and the quality that Koroglu believed was Darsan's greatest asset, the ability to inspire loyalty in men who had no obligation to follow him. He told Selim about the raid on the training camp, about the way Darsan had handled the confrontation with the soldiers, about the decision to lower the bow rather than kill the fleeing man, and Selim listened to this account with a slight smile that revealed more than any words could have, the smile of a man who has found what he was looking for and is satisfied with the discovery. The visit to Selim ended with a more concrete outcome than the visit to Arslan. Selim agreed not just to think about defection, but to begin preparing for it, quietly redirecting certain supply flows within the system he controlled, creating small, strategic reserves at locations that would be useful to Darsan's forces if and when the break came, and building a communication network among sympathetic logistics personnel that could be activated on short notice. These preparations were invisible to anyone not looking for them, hidden within the normal fluctuations of a complex supply system, and their discovery by Damir Khan's loyalists was unlikely as long as Selim maintained the routine patterns of his official duties, which he was more than capable of doing, because Selim was a man who understood systems, and a man who understands systems can manipulate them without disrupting them, the way a surgeon can operate on a body without killing it. The third visit was the most dangerous and the most important, and Koroglu made it last because it required the most preparation and the most nerve. The man he went to see was called Bayezid, and Bayezid was not a junior officer or a logistics specialist but a senior commander, one of the 3 men who reported directly to Damir Khan and who commanded a division of 600 soldiers, the largest single formation in the Karasi military outside of Damir Khan's personal guard. Bayezid was a man of enormous physical presence and limited patience, a warrior whose reputation had been built on the battlefield rather than in the council chamber, and whose loyalty to the Karasi chieftaincy was so deeply ingrained that it was practically a physiological characteristic, as much a part of him as the color of his eyes or the breadth of his shoulders. But Koroglu knew something about Bayezid that few others knew, something that he had observed during a conversation many months ago, a conversation that had taken place around a campfire after a day of exercises, when the wine had flowed freely and tongues had loosened, and the guards that men normally maintain around their private thoughts had been lowered just enough to allow a glimpse of what lay beneath. Bayezid had spoken briefly and with obvious discomfort about his son, a young man of 16 who had been assigned to Damir Khan's personal guard as a mark of honor, and who had, in the months since his assignment, been transformed from a cheerful, eager boy into a sullen, withdrawn youth who flinched at sudden movements and refused to speak about what happened in the guards' barracks. Bayezid had not elaborated, and Koroglu had not pressed, but the implication was clear, and the fury in Bayezid's eyes, a fury that was directed not outward but inward, the fury of a father who suspects that his child is being mistreated but who feels powerless to intervene because the mistreatment is being sanctioned by the authority he has sworn to serve, was something that Koroglu had never forgotten. He approached Bayezid's camp with the formal protocol that a visit between officers of their respective ranks required, sending a rider ahead to request an audience and waiting at the perimeter until permission was granted. The wait was longer than expected, and when the permission came, it was accompanied by an escort of 4 soldiers whose expressions were not welcoming, and Koroglu rode through the camp with the uncomfortable awareness that every eye was on him, and that many of those eyes were hostile, because word of Darsan's rebellion had spread through the Karasi territory like a virus, infecting every conversation and every relationship with the suspicion that anyone might be a sympathizer. That anyone might be the next to break faith, and the atmosphere in every Karasi camp and outpost had become charged with a paranoia that was destructive but understandable. Bayezid received him in his command tent, a large, sparsely furnished space that reflected its occupant's personality, practical, unadorned, focused on function rather than comfort. The commander was seated behind a rough wooden table, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his face set in an expression that was neither friendly nor hostile but watchful, the expression of a man who has been warned that the visitor sitting across from him may be an enemy but who has not yet made up his mind. Koroglu knew that the approach he had used with Arslan and Selim would not work here. Bayezid was not a man who responded to emotional appeals or strategic analysis. He was a man who responded to strength, to directness, to the kind of forthright, unvarnished honesty that he practiced himself and that he demanded from everyone who sought his attention. So Koroglu dispensed with the preliminary pleasantries and the careful, indirect approach that he had used with the others, and he looked Bayezid in the eye and said simply that he knew about Bayezid's son, that he knew what was happening in Damir Khan's guard, and that the man who was supposed to protect the young warriors of the Karasi was instead allowing them to be brutalized, and that this, more than any political calculation or strategic assessment, was the reason that Koroglu was sitting in this tent today. The effect of these words on Bayezid was immediate and devastating. The color drained from his face, and then flooded back in a rush that turned his skin dark red, and his hands, which had been resting on his crossed arms, dropped to the table and gripped its edge with a force that made the wood creak, and the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables under tension, and his jaw clenched so tightly that Koroglu could hear his teeth grinding, and for a long, terrible moment, Koroglu thought that Bayezid was going to kill him. That the words had breached a wall behind which something enormous and destructive had been confined, and that the release of this force would be directed at the man who had triggered it, rather than at the man who had caused it. But Bayezid did not kill him. Instead, after a silence that lasted for what felt like an hour but was probably no more than 30 seconds, the commander's grip on the table loosened, and his shoulders dropped, and his chin fell to his chest, and the transformation was so complete and so sudden that it was like watching a fortress collapse, the walls that had been holding back the weight of emotion for months crumbling in an instant. And the man who remained was not the fearsome warrior that the Karasi army knew and respected, but a father, a broken, furious, heartbroken father who had been carrying a burden that no parent should have to carry, and who had just been offered, for the first time, the possibility of setting it down. He told Koroglu everything. He spoke in a low, rapid monotone, the words tumbling out of him with the unstoppable force of water through a broken dam, and the story he told was uglier than Koroglu had imagined, a story of systematic abuse within Damir Khan's personal guard, young soldiers subjected to humiliation and violence by their senior officers under the guise of discipline and training, and Damir Khan's knowledge of and complicity in this abuse. Because the culture of the guard was a reflection of its commander's character, and a commander who allies himself with the enemies of his people is a commander whose moral compass has been so thoroughly corrupted that no atrocity is beyond him. Bayezid said that he had confronted Damir Khan about his son, that he had gone to the chieftain's eldest son, and had demanded that the boy be released from the guard and returned to his family, and that Damir Khan had refused, not with violence but with something worse, with the cool, contemptuous dismissal of a man who holds all the power and knows it, telling Bayezid that his son was the property of the guard, and that any attempt to remove him would be treated as insubordination. The word property, applied to his own child, was the word that had broken something inside Bayezid, and it was the word that Koroglu now used as the fulcrum of his appeal, because a man who has heard his son called property by the man who is supposed to lead and protect him is a man who has already made his decision, even if he does not yet know it. Koroglu did not need to make the case for defection. He simply told Bayezid about Darsan, about the young man's rebellion, about the alliance with the Ottomans, about the plan to fracture Damir Khan's power base and create an alternative that would serve the true interests of the Karasi people rather than the personal ambitions of one man. And he told Bayezid that Darsan would come for his son, that one of the first acts of the rebellion, when it was ready, would be the liberation of the young soldiers held in Damir Khan's guard, and that Bayezid's boy would be returned to his father, not as property but as a person, free and whole and safe. Bayezid looked at Koroglu, and the eyes that looked out from that weathered, battle-scarred face were the eyes of a man who has been lost in darkness for a long time and has just seen a light, distant and uncertain but real. And the hope in those eyes was painful to see because it was so raw, so unprotected, so completely at odds with the iron exterior that Bayezid presented to the world. And Koroglu understood in that moment that the most powerful weapon in any conflict is not the sword or the bow or the strategic genius of the commander, but the love of a father for his child. Because this love, when it is threatened, when it is violated, when it is turned against itself by the cruelty of men who have no love of their own, becomes a force that can move mountains and shatter armies and change the course of history. Bey'in said one word, yes, and the word was spoken with a finality that allowed no qualification and no retreat, and in the sound of that single syllable was the full weight of 600 soldiers and their commander, a force that, when combined with the forces that Arslan and Selim could bring to bear, would create a coalition powerful enough to challenge Demir Khan directly and to fundamentally alter the balance of power within the Karasi territory. Koroglu left Bey'in's camp with the careful, controlled pace of a man who does not want to attract attention, but who is carrying news so significant that every fiber of his being is screaming at him to run, to ride, to fly back to Darsan with the message that the impossible has happened, that the walls are cracking, that the structure that Demir Khan has built is not as solid as it appears, and that the right push at the right moment applied to the right point will bring the whole thing down. He rode through the Karasi countryside in the fading afternoon light, and the landscape around him, the same hills and valleys and villages that he had ridden through that morning, seemed different now, charged with a significance that it had not possessed before, because the world changes when you change your relationship to it, and Koroglu's relationship to this land had just undergone a transformation that made everything he saw feel new and full of possibility, dangerous possibility, uncertain possibility. But possibility nonetheless, and after months of feeling trapped and directionless, the mere presence of possibility was intoxicating. He reached his village as darkness fell, and he found Darsan's messenger waiting for him, a young man named Yusuf who had been sent from Bursa with instructions to serve as the communication link between Koroglu's network and the Ottoman command. Yusuf was barely 20, with the lean, hungry look of a youth who has been tested by hardship and has emerged sharper rather than broken, and he carried in his saddlebag a set of coded instructions from Darsan that laid out the next phase of the operation, the timeline for coordinated action, the signals that would be used to communicate between the scattered elements of the conspiracy, and the contingency plans that would be activated if any element was compromised. Koroglu read the instructions by the light of a single candle, his lips moving silently as he decoded the cipher that Darsan had devised, a simple substitution code based on a shared text that both men knew by heart, and the message that emerged from the cipher was both thrilling and terrifying in its specificity. Darsan wanted to move within 10 days. 10 days to coordinate the defection of multiple Karasi units across a territory that was under active surveillance by Demir Khan's loyalists. 10 days to bring Arslan's tentative agreement to firm commitment, to activate Selim's supply network, to prepare Bey'in's 600 soldiers for a reversal of allegiance that would be irreversible once it began. 10 days to do something that would normally take months, because the pressure from the Byzantine advance and the Ottoman defense of Bursa created a window of opportunity that would not remain open indefinitely, and Darsan understood, as Orhan understood, that the difference between a plan that succeeds and a plan that fails is often nothing more than the willingness to act before conditions are perfect. Koroglu set down the decoded message and stared at the candle flame, and the flame danced in a draught that crept under the door, throwing patterns of light and shadow across the rough walls of his kitchen, and he thought about what he had just read and what it meant, and whether it was possible, whether 10 days was enough, whether the network he was building could hold together under the pressure of a timeline that left almost no margin for error. And then he thought about Bey'in's son, and the fury in Bey'in's eyes, and the single word of commitment that had been spoken with a force that could shatter stone, and he decided that 10 days was enough, that it had to be enough, that the world does not offer perfect conditions, and that the men who wait for perfection are the men who never act and never change anything and go to their graves still waiting. He burned the decoded message in the candle flame, watching the paper curl and blacken and dissolve into ash, and then he sat down at his table and began writing his own coded messages, one for Arslan, one for Selim, one for Bey'in, each one tailored to the recipient, each one containing the specific information and instructions that that particular man would need to prepare his part of the operation, and the scratching of his pen against the rough paper was the only sound in the house, a small, persistent sound that seemed entirely inadequate to the magnitude of what it was producing. But that is the nature of conspiracy and revolution, that the great transformations of the world begin not with the clash of armies or the thunder of cannon, but with the quiet scratching of a pen in a small room, the whispered conversation between two men in a kitchen, the single word spoken by a father whose love has been weaponized by the cruelty of the powerful. Back in Bursa, the morning brought intelligence that changed the complexion of the entire campaign. The rider that Evranosh had dispatched arrived at the palace gates just as the sun cleared the eastern hills, and his report was delivered directly to Turhan, who was on the walls as always, his cloak stiff with frost, his eyes red-rimmed from another night without sleep, his posture unbowed despite the exhaustion that was visible in every line of his body. The report contained Evranosh's assessment of the Byzantine column's condition, its reduced pace, its nervous formation, its depleted supplies, and the psychological impact of the sustained harassment that had been maintained since the baggage train raid. Tarhan read the report twice, the second time more slowly underlining certain passages with the tip of his finger, and then he descended from the walls and carried the report to Orhan, who received it in his war room with the map still spread across the table and the carved figures still arranged in their positions, a frozen tableau of the conflict that was playing out across hundreds of miles of terrain. Orhan read the report and asked Tarhan what he thought, and Tarhan gave his assessment with the usual combination of precision and caution, noting that the Byzantine advance had been slowed but not stopped, that the harassment was effective but unsustainable at its current intensity because Evranosh's force was small and would eventually be worn down by the constant demands of patrolling and raiding, and that the fundamental problem remained. That a force of 3,000 to 4,000 was still advancing on a city defended by a garrison of perhaps 1,500, and that the arithmetic of siege warfare, while modified by the quality of the defenses and the skill of the defenders, was ultimately a numbers game that favored the larger force. Orhan nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere, already working on the problem from an angle that Tarhan had not considered, because Orhan's genius was not in the execution of tactics, but in the perception of connections, the ability to see relationships between events and forces that others perceived as separate, to recognize patterns in the chaos of war that revealed opportunities, invisible to minds that processed information sequentially rather than holistically. He asked Tarhan a question that seemed at first to have nothing to do with the Byzantine advance. He asked about Ispocha, about her progress, about whether any word had been received from her since her departure. Tarhan said that no word had been received, which was expected, since Ispocha's mission required absolute secrecy, and any communication with Bursa during the journey would risk exposing her route and her purpose. Orhan nodded again, and then he said something that made Tarhan stop and reassess his understanding of the situation. Orhan said that the Shahanshah knew about Ispocha's departure. He said it with the certainty of a man stating a mathematical fact, not a guess or a suspicion, but a conclusion derived from the logical analysis of the Shahanshah's behavior, because the cautious pace of the Byzantine advance, which Evranosh had attributed to the psychological impact of the harassment, was also consistent with a commander who was waiting for intelligence, who was holding back his main force while his agents tracked a separate threat, a threat that was not military but political. A threat that could do more damage to his position than any army. If the Shahanshah knew about Ispocha, then Ispocha was in danger, and her danger was not just a humanitarian concern but a strategic one, because the success of her mission was a critical component of the larger plan, the component that would create internal pressure within the Byzantine court and force the Shahanshah to divert attention and resources from the military campaign to the management of domestic opposition. If Ispocha was intercepted before she reached her contacts within the Byzantine aristocracy, the entire political dimension of the strategy would collapse, and the military pressure on Bursa would continue unrelieved. Orhan gave Tarhan new orders. A fast rider would be dispatched immediately, taking the same western route that Ispocha had followed, with instructions to find her escort and warn them that their mission was known, that Byzantine agents were likely tracking them, and that they should alter their route and their timeline to avoid interception. The rider would carry a sealed letter from Orhan to Ispocha herself, containing updated intelligence about the Byzantine court that might prove useful, and a personal message that Tarhan was not permitted to read, but that he could guess the contents of, because Orhan's face as he wrote it bore the expression of a man who is acutely aware that the person he is writing to may not survive to read his words. Tarhan selected the rider personally, choosing a man named Kerem, whose horsemanship was legendary, even among the Ottomans, and whose ability to cover ground at speed was matched only by his ability to do so without being detected. Kerem departed within the hour, his horse fresh, his saddlebag containing the sealed letter, and a supply of dried food sufficient for 3 days of hard riding, and the western gate opened just wide enough to let him through before closing again with the solid, reassuring thud that had become the city's most familiar sound. Meanwhile, Evranosh had launched the second day of harassment operations, and the pattern he established was designed to be unpredictable, because predictability in harassment is the same as ineffectiveness, and an enemy who can predict when and where the next attack will come can prepare for it and negate its impact. Instead of repeating the baggage train raid, which the Byzantines were now prepared for, Evranosh targeted the column's water supply, striking at a stream crossing where the army would need to halt and water its horses and fill its canteens, the kind of routine logistical pause that an army takes for granted until it is denied. His riders arrived at the crossing before the Byzantine column and contaminated the water with the intestinal contents of a freshly slaughtered sheep, a crude but effective technique that would not poison the water fatally but would make it undrinkable, and anyone who did drink it would suffer intestinal distress that would render them combat ineffective for at least 24 hours. They then withdrew to a position upstream and waited, watching as the Byzantine vanguard arrived at the crossing and the first soldiers waded into the stream to fill their water skins. And the expressions on the soldiers' faces when they detected the contamination, the mixture of disgust and frustration, and the dawning realization that even the most basic elements of their march were being contested, was a small but significant victory in the ongoing campaign of psychological attrition. The column was forced to continue its march without replenishing its water supply, which meant that by nightfall, men and horses would be dehydrated, and dehydration in winter, while less immediately dangerous than in summer, still degrades physical performance and cognitive function, making soldiers slower, clumsier, more prone to errors of judgment, and more susceptible to the creeping despair that is the true objective of any harassment campaign. Evranosh did not stop there. In the afternoon, he sent Zeliha and 3 riders on a mission that was part reconnaissance and part sabotage, tasking them with locating the Byzantine army's forward supply depot, the prepositioned cache of food and equipment that the Shahanshah had established along the line of advance to sustain his forces during the approach to Bursa. Zeliha moved through the forest with the silent, focused intensity that made her one of the most effective scouts in the Ottoman military, her eyes reading the terrain with the same fluency that a scholar reads a text, identifying the signs of recent traffic, the ruts of wagon wheels, the droppings of mules, the broken branches at the height of a mounted rider's passage, and following these signs with unerring accuracy to clearing 3 miles north of the main road, where a dozen wagons were parked in a circle around a central cookfire, guarded by a platoon of Byzantine infantry who were clearly bored and clearly not expecting trouble. She observed the depot for 2 hours, counting the guards, noting their patrol patterns, identifying the gaps in their coverage that would allow a small force to approach undetected, and then she withdrew and reported her findings to Evranosh, and the report she delivered was delivered with the concise efficiency of a professional who understands that intelligence is most valuable when it is most actionable, and the action she recommended was the immediate destruction of the depot. Evranosh agreed, and the raid was planned and executed within 3 hours of Zeliha's return. 10 riders approached the depot from 3 directions, timing their assault to coincide with the changing of the guard, the same tactic that Bayram and Kemal had used to enter Chanali, exploiting the moment of transition when attention is divided and reaction time is slowest. The attack was swift, violent, and decisive. The guards were overwhelmed before they could form a defensive line, the wagons were set on fire, the stores of grain and dried meat and fodder were destroyed, and the raiders withdrew with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance, each rider covering the next, each movement flowing into the next movement, the entire operation completed in less than 15 minutes. The destruction of the forward depot was a blow that the Shahanshah felt immediately, because it meant that his army's next resupply point no longer existed, and the distance between his current position and the next available source of provisions had just doubled. He was faced with a choice that no commander wants to make, the choice between continuing the advance with inadequate supplies, which risked the kind of logistical breakdown that has destroyed more armies than any enemy ever has, or halting the advance and sending for additional supplies from his base camp, which meant more delay, more time for the Ottomans to strengthen their defenses, and more time for the psychological attrition of harassment to erode the morale of his troops. He chose the latter, and the order to halt was received by his soldiers with a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief because they were tired and hungry, and the prospect of continuing to march through hostile territory was not appealing, and frustration because they were professional soldiers who understood that a halt in the advance was not a pause but a setback, and setbacks have a way of compounding, each one making the next one more likely. Until the accumulated weight of delays and losses transforms an offensive campaign into a defensive one, and a defensive campaign into a retreat, and a retreat into a rout. The Shahanshah sat in his command tent that evening, surrounded by maps and dispatches and the silence of advisors who had run out of advice, and he stared at the candle that burned on his table, and the candle's flame was steady and unwavering, and he hated it for its steadiness, because his own situation was anything but steady, and the contrast between the flame's calm and his own turmoil was an insult that he felt personally, irrationally. The way a man in crisis takes offense at things that have nothing to do with his crisis, but that serve as convenient targets for the rage that has nowhere else to go. Mahmoud sat beside him and said what Mahmoud always said, which was nothing, but the quality of his silence had changed. The silence of a man who is thinking not about the current problem, but about its ultimate implications. And when the Shahanshah finally turned to him and demanded to know what he was thinking, Mahmoud spoke with a deliberation that made every word seem like it had been weighed and measured and found to be exactly the right word for the moment. He said that the campaign was not failing, but that it was not succeeding, and that the difference between the two was the difference between a door that is locked and a door that is merely closed, and that Orhan was the kind of man who understood this difference, and who would continue to push against the door until it opened or until his strength gave out, and that the Shahanshah needed to decide whether his own strength was greater than Orhan's or whether it was not, and to make this decision quickly. Because every day of indecision was a day that favored the defense over the offense, the local over the distant, the rooted over the marching. The Shahanshah did not respond, because there was no response that would not reveal the doubt that was growing inside him like a vine in a crack, sending tendrils into every part of his thinking, and he was not yet ready to admit to that doubt, not to Mahmoud, not to himself, not to the darkness that pressed against the walls of his tent and whispered suggestions that he was not strong enough and not clever enough and not ruthless enough to do what his ancestors had done, and the candle burned on. Steady and mocking, and the night deepened, and the Byzantine army sat in its camp and waited for supplies that were still 2 days away, and the stars turned overhead, and somewhere in the forest, Evranosh was already planning tomorrow's operation. And in Bursa, in the quiet of the evening, Fatima stood at the window of her quarters and looked out at the city, and the bow was still on the table behind her, and the quiver was still full of arrows, and the henna on her hands had faded to a pale amber that was almost invisible against her skin, the last traces of the celebration disappearing like a dream fading in the morning light. And she pressed her hand against the glass, and felt the cold seep through, and thought of Evranosh out there in the darkness, out there in the forest with his sword and his horse and his 40 riders, and she did not pray for his safety, because she knew that safety was not something that could be prayed for in a world like this, a world where the bravest men were the ones most likely to ride toward danger rather than away from it. Instead, she prayed for his strength, for the sharpness of his blade, for the swiftness of his horse, for the loyalty of his men, and for the dawn that would bring him one day closer to coming home. The glass fogged beneath her breath, and through the fog she could see the fires on the walls, the sentries moving between them, the dark outline of the mountains against the sky, and the world beyond the glass was cold and dangerous and full of men who wanted to destroy everything she loved. And she stood there, small and alone and newly married, and carrying within her courage that she had not known she possessed until it was demanded of her, and the silence of the room wrapped around her like armor. And the bow on the table behind her gleamed in the candlelight, ready, always ready, and the night continued its slow, patient revolution toward whatever dawn awaited it. And the story went on because the story must go on, because the people who inhabit it do not know how to stop, do not know the meaning of surrender, do not understand the concept of defeat as anything other than a temporary setback on the way to a victory that may take years or decades or centuries to achieve, but that is coming, always coming, carried forward by the will and the sacrifice and the unbreakable faith of men and women who believe, with every fiber of their being, that what they are fighting for is worth fighting for, and that the world they are building, stone by stone, prayer by prayer, arrow by arrow, is a world worth building, and that the dawn when it comes will find them still standing, still fighting, still believing, still continuing, because that is who they are, and that is what they do, and that is the story of Orhan Sahib, not a story of endings but a story of beginnings. Not a story of one man, but a story of all the men and women who chose to stand with him, and to face the wind, and to ride into the darkness, and to return, always to return, carrying the light. The rider named Kerem had been pushing his horse hard through the western passes for nearly 2 days, when the landscape began to change around him, in ways that had nothing to do with geography, and everything to do with the invisible boundary between the territory where Ottoman authority still held meaning, and the territory where it dissolved into nothing more than a memory, a claim written on maps that the people who actually lived on the land neither recognized nor respected. The trees here were different, older and more gnarled, their trunks twisted by centuries of wind that blew in from the coast carrying salt and moisture that corroded everything it touched, metal and wood and stone, and the resolve of men who traveled through it without the protection of numbers or walls. The road, such as it was, had deteriorated from the maintained surface of the Ottoman heartland to a rutted track that wound between boulders and across streambeds that were swollen with winter runoff, and Kerem's horse, a magnificent grey stallion whose stamina had been bred into its bloodline over generations, was beginning to show the first signs of the deep fatigue that comes not from a single hard effort but from the sustained, grinding exertion of covering difficult ground at speed for hour after hour, without adequate rest. Kerem dismounted at a stream crossing and led the horse to the water, and while the animal drank, he scanned the terrain ahead with the automatic vigilance that had been trained into him so thoroughly that it operated below the level of conscious thought, his eyes moving in the systematic pattern that experienced scouts used to cover a landscape without missing any detail. Near ground first, then middle distance, then far distance, then back to near ground. A continuous sweep that processed information at a speed that would have been impossible for an untrained observer. He saw nothing threatening, but the absence of threat was itself a cause for concern, because the western approaches to Byzantine territory were not empty, they were patrolled, and the fact that he had not encountered a single patrol in the last 6 hours suggested either that the patrols had been withdrawn, which would indicate a redeployment of forces that might be related to Spoch's mission, or that the patrols were present but concealed, which would indicate that someone was waiting for something or someone to pass through this area before revealing themselves. He tightened the girth on his saddle and remounted and continued west, his hand resting on the hilt of the short sword that hung at his hip, not gripping it but touching it, maintaining contact with the instrument of his survival the way a blind man maintains contact with his guide's arm, and the road climbed into a series of low hills that offered long sightlines in every direction, and Kerem used these sightlines to scan the landscape with renewed intensity. And it was on the crest of the third hill that he saw what he had been looking for, and what he had been dreading. Smoke! Not the thick black smoke of a military encampment or the thin white smoke of a village hearth, but the grey, dispersed smoke of a fire that has been hastily extinguished, a fire that someone started and then realized was a mistake and tried to put out before it could be seen, but smoke, once released, cannot be recalled any more than words can be unspoken or arrows can be unfired. And the grey smudge against the pale winter sky was as clear a signal to Kerem's trained eyes as a flag planted on a hilltop. He adjusted his course, angling away from the road and toward the source of the smoke, moving now with the exaggerated caution of a man who knows he is approaching a situation that could be friendly or hostile or somewhere in the treacherous middle ground between the two. He dismounted again and tied his horse in a thicket of dense brush that would conceal the animal from casual observation, and he continued on foot, moving through the undergrowth with the slow, deliberate movements that minimize noise and visual signature, placing each foot on ground he had already inspected, avoiding the dry leaves and brittle twigs that would betray his presence with a crack or a rustle. He found the source of the smoke in a small hollow between two hills, a natural depression that was sheltered from the wind and invisible from the road, and what he found there made him stop and press himself flat against the cold ground and hold his breath while his mind processed what his eyes were showing him. There were horses, 6 of them, tethered to a line strung between 2 trees, and beside the horses were the remnants of the extinguished fire, a circle of blackened stones with wisps of steam still rising from the wet ashes where water had been thrown to douse the flames. Around the fire were the signs of a camp that had been occupied and then hastily abandoned, a blanket left crumpled on the ground, a water skin hanging from a branch, the impression in the soft earth where someone had been sitting, and scattered among these signs of recent habitation were other signs that made Kerem's blood run cold, because they told a story that he did not want to hear but that he could not ignore. There were marks on the ground that were not footprints but drag marks, the kind of parallel furrows that are left when a person is pulled across soft earth by their arms or their legs, and beside the drag marks were spots of something dark that might have been spilled tea or might have been blood, and the distinction mattered enormously but could not be determined from Kerem's current position. And he lay on the cold ground and stared at these marks, and felt the weight of the sealed letter in his saddlebag pressing against his consciousness like a stone on his chest. He waited for an hour, motionless, watching the abandoned camp for any sign of movement, any indication that the people who had made it were still nearby, and when the hour had passed without any change, he rose cautiously and approached the camp, and the closer he got, the clearer the story became, and the story was not a good one. The dark spots were blood, not a large amount, not the arterial spray of a fatal wound, but enough to indicate a struggle, a blow struck, resistance offered and overcome. The drag marks led from the campfire to the horse line and then continued beyond it, heading west toward Byzantine territory, and the depth and definition of the tracks suggested that whoever had been dragged was not walking under their own power. The blanket on the ground was of Ottoman make, the weave and the dye pattern consistent with the kind of traveling gear that would be issued to a diplomatic escort, and beside it, half buried in the churned earth, was a small object that Kerem picked up and held in his palm and stared at with an expression that combined recognition with dread. It was a pendant, a small gold pendant in the shape of the Byzantine double-headed eagle, and Kerem had never seen it before, but he knew immediately what it was and who it belonged to, because there was only one person in Orhan Saheb's court who would carry such an object, a person whose identity bridged the gap between Ottoman and Byzantine, whose very existence was a statement of the complex, intertwined, mutually destructive relationship between the two powers. And that person was a spotcher. The pendant's chain was broken, snapped at the clasp, the kind of damage that occurs when a necklace is torn from someone's neck by force, and the implication was unmistakable. A spotcher and her escort had been intercepted. They had been attacked here in this hollow between the hills, surprised while they rested, and they had been taken, some or all of them, west toward the Byzantine court, toward the Shahanshah's agents, toward whatever fate awaited a woman who was considered both a traitor and a political liability by the power that had given her birth. Kerem stood in the ruined camp and made the fastest, hardest decision of his life. He could continue west, following the tracks, attempting to locate a spotcher and her captors, but he was one man against an unknown number of enemies in unfamiliar territory, and the odds of success were negligible, while the odds of joining a spotcher in captivity were very high. Or he could return to Bursa, carrying the pendant and the intelligence it represented, delivering to Orhan Sahib the news that one of the critical elements of his strategy had been compromised, and that the woman he had promised to protect was now in the hands of the enemy. Neither option was acceptable, and yet one of them had to be chosen, because standing in a blood-stained camp holding a broken necklace was not a strategy, it was a paralysis, and Kerem was not a man who indulged in paralysis. He looked west toward the tracks that disappeared into the trees, and he looked east, toward Bursa and the Sultan who was waiting for news, and the conflict in his chest was so intense that it felt like a physical tearing, as though the two impulses were gripping opposite sides of his heart and pulling in different directions. He chose east, he chose Bursa. He chose to carry the news rather than to attempt the rescue, because the news itself was a weapon, and a weapon delivered to the right hands at the right time could accomplish more than a single rider charging into the unknown. He pocketed the pendant and returned to his horse and mounted, and turned the animal's head toward home and rode, and the ride was the hardest he had ever made, not because of the terrain or the distance or the exhaustion of his mount, but because of the weight of what he was carrying, the weight of failure, the weight of a broken promise, the weight of a woman's fate pressing against his heart with every stride. He rode through the night, stopping only when the horse's breathing became so labored that continuing would risk killing the animal, and during these stops he stood beside the horse in the darkness, and listened to the night sounds and thought about a spotcher, and wondered where she was and whether she was alive and whether the courage that had been so evident in her decision to accept this mission was still with her now, in whatever cell or tent or wagon she was being held in, and he hoped that it was. Because courage in captivity is different from courage in freedom, darker and more desperate and more necessary, and the people who possess it are the people who survive, and Kerem wanted a spotcher to survive, not because of her strategic value but because she was a person, a human being who had been entrusted to the protection of men who had failed to protect her, and the failure burned in his chest like acid. He reached Bursa on the morning of the third day, and the western gate opened to admit him, and he passed through the streets on a horse that was stumbling with exhaustion, his own body barely able to maintain its seat in the saddle, and the guards at the palace gate took one look at his face and summoned Turhan without being asked, because the expression Kerem wore was the expression of a man carrying news that would change things, and the guards had seen that expression before and knew what it meant. Turhan met him in the courtyard, and Kerem dismounted and nearly fell, his legs buckling after 3 days of continuous riding, and Turhan caught his arm and steadied him and asked the question with his eyes, and Kerem answered by reaching into his saddlebag and producing the pendant, holding it out in his open palm, the gold eagle glinting in the morning light, the broken chain dangling between his fingers like a severed lifeline. Turhan looked at the pendant, and his face underwent the same transformation that Kerem's had undergone in the hollow between the hills, the rapid sequence of recognition, comprehension, and the cold, heavy settling of dread that comes from understanding the full implications of a single small object. He took the pendant from Kerem's hand and closed his fist around it, and the gold pressed into his palm, and the shape of the eagle left an impression in his flesh that he would carry for hours afterward, a physical reminder of the woman whose fate had just become the most urgent crisis in a situation that was already overflowing with crises. He told Kerem to rest, to eat, to sleep, and then to report to the war room in 4 hours for a full debriefing, and Kerem obeyed because obedience was the only thing holding him together, the structure of command providing a framework for action that his exhausted mind could no longer construct on its own. And Turhan turned and walked toward the Sultan's chambers, the pendant in his fist, his stride long and purposeful, his mind already working through the implications and the options and the terrible arithmetic of a situation in which every variable had just shifted against them. He found Orhan in the war room, as he always found him, standing before the map, the carved figures arranged in their positions, the candle burning with its steady, unwavering flame, and the room was quiet except for the barely audible sound of Orhan's breathing, the breathing of a man who is deep in thought and who does not wish to be disturbed, but who has trained himself to be always available, always responsive, always ready to receive whatever the world throws at him. Orhan did not speak. He simply opened his hand and held it out, palm up, and the pendant lay there, the eagle's two heads staring in opposite directions, east and west, Ottoman and Byzantine, the dual identity of the woman who had worn it captured in the symbolism of the ornament she had carried since childhood, and Orhan looked at the pendant, and for a long moment, for the space of 5 heartbeats, maybe 6, his face showed nothing, absolutely nothing. The mask of command so complete and so impenetrable that even Orhan, who had known him for 20 years, could not read what was happening behind it. And then the mask cracked. Not visibly, not in any way that an outside observer would have detected, but Orhan saw it, the almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes, the faint tremor at the corner of the mouth, the slight flaring of the nostrils that accompanies a breath drawn in to steady a body that is threatening to betray the mind that controls it, and these micro-expressions, these tiny fissures in the surface of supreme composure, told Orhan everything he needed to know about the depth of Orhan's response. Because a man who shows nothing is not a man who feels nothing, but a man who feels so much that the showing would be catastrophic. Orhan took the pendant from Orhan's palm and held it between his thumb and forefinger, turning it slowly, examining it the way one examines a wound, not out of curiosity, but out of the need to understand the full extent of the damage before deciding on the course of treatment. He asked Orhan for the full report, and Orhan gave it, relaying Kerem's account in precise, unemotional language, the abandoned camp, the blood, the drag marks, the tracks leading west, the broken chain, the assessment that a spotcher and her escort had been intercepted and taken by Byzantine agents. When the report was complete, the silence in the war room was the heaviest silence Orhan had ever experienced, a silence that had physical weight, that pressed against the walls and the ceiling and the floor, that made the air thick and difficult to breathe, the silence of a man who is confronting the consequences of a decision he made and is determining whether to let those consequences define his response or whether to absorb them and continue forward on the same course. Because changing course in the face of setback is sometimes wisdom and sometimes weakness, and the line between the two is visible only to the man who has to walk it. Orhan set the pendant down on the map table, and it landed in the space that represented the western approaches, the territory between Bursa and the Byzantine frontier, the territory where a spotcher had been taken, and the placement was precise and deliberate, the pendant serving as a new piece on the board, a new variable in the strategic calculus, a new factor that had to be accounted for in every plan and every calculation that followed. He spoke, and his voice was steady, not the artificial steadiness of a man suppressing his emotions, but the genuine steadiness of a man who has processed his emotions and has emerged on the other side of them with his purpose intact and his mind clear. He said that a spotcher's capture was a blow, a serious blow, but that it was not a fatal one, because the strategy had been designed with the understanding that any single element might fail, and the failure of one element did not necessitate the failure of the whole. The diplomatic mission to the Byzantine court was compromised, yes, but the military elements, Evranosh's harassment campaign, Orhan's defense of the walls, Jurkutai's deception at Chanali and Darsan's conspiracy within the Karasi territory, were all still functioning, and if these elements could be brought to fruition, the political pressure that a spotcher's mission was supposed to create might prove unnecessary. But he added something else, something that revealed the personal dimension of his response, the dimension that existed beneath the strategic analysis and the military calculations. He said that a spotcher was his amana, his sacred trust, and that the word amana did not come with conditions or qualifications, did not apply only when circumstances were favorable or risks were manageable, but applied always in every situation regardless of cost, because a trust that is abandoned when it becomes inconvenient is not a trust at all but a convenience, and the distinction between the two was the distinction between a man of honor and a man of calculation. And Orhan intended to be the former, even when the latter would have been easier. He told Orhan that a rescue would be attempted, not immediately, not rashly, not at the expense of the other operations that were in progress, but deliberately, carefully, with the same level of planning and preparation that had been devoted to every other element of the campaign. He told Orhan to assemble a team, small and fast and capable of operating deep in enemy territory without support, a team whose mission would be to locate a spotcher, determine the conditions of her captivity, and execute a rescue if a viable opportunity presented itself. Orhan accepted this order with the inward recognition that it was probably the most dangerous mission he had ever been tasked with organizing, because the team would be operating hundreds of miles from any friendly force, in territory controlled by an enemy who was expecting exactly this kind of response, and the margin for error was not slim but non-existent. A single mistake, a single moment of bad luck, a single alert sentry or barking dog or loose stone dislodged at the wrong moment would mean the death of everyone involved and the loss of a resource that the Ottoman military could not afford to lose. But Tarhan did not argue, because he understood, as he had always understood, that Orhan's decisions were never purely military. They were expressions of a philosophy of leadership that placed honor and obligation above pragmatic calculation, and this philosophy, while sometimes inconvenient and occasionally dangerous, was the reason that men followed Orhan Sahib with a loyalty that transcended self-interest and that could not be purchased or compelled but only earned. And it was earned precisely through decisions like this one, decisions that said your life matters, your trust matters, and I will not abandon you. Not because it is strategically advantageous to rescue you, but because I promised, and a promise is a debt that must be paid regardless of the interest. He left the war room and began the process of selecting the rescue team, and the criteria he used were the most stringent he had ever applied, because the men he chose would need to be more than just skilled fighters and experienced scouts. They would need to be the kind of men who could think on their feet, adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, make life-or-death decisions without hesitation or second-guessing. And do all of this while maintaining the absolute operational security that the mission demanded. He would lead the team himself. This decision was not made for dramatic effect or out of a sense of obligation, but out of the practical assessment that he was the most qualified person available for the job, and that sending someone less qualified on a mission this important was not prudence but dereliction. He selected 4 men to accompany him. The first was Kerem, because despite his exhaustion, Kerem was the only person who had seen the camp and could guide the team back to the point where the trail began. The second was a man called Boran, a tracker whose ability to follow a trail over hard ground and through water and across open rock was considered supernatural by those who had witnessed it, and who attributed to him an almost mystical sensitivity to the signs that living creatures leave upon the land. The third was Orhan, whom Evranosh had released from the harassment force specifically for this mission, a man whose expertise in ambush and close-quarters combat would be invaluable if the rescue required a direct assault on whatever facility or camp was holding a spotcher. And the fourth was a woman whose inclusion surprised everyone except Tarhan himself, a healer named Safiye whose medical skills were the best in Bursa, and whose presence on the team was dictated by the probability, that a spotcher would need medical attention when she was found, because captivity in the hands of Byzantine agents was not a gentle experience. And a rescue that recovered a woman too injured to travel would be a rescue that had succeeded in its first objective only to fail in its second. The team assembled in the pre-dawn darkness of the following morning, 5 figures standing in the shadows of the postern gate, their faces blackened with charcoal, their armor stripped down to the minimum necessary for protection, their weapons selected for close-quarters effectiveness rather than battlefield versatility, short swords rather than long ones, daggers rather than spears. Bows with reduced draw weight that could be carried compactly and deployed quickly in the confined spaces where a rescue operation was likely to take place. They carried provisions for 5 days, water for 3, and a small kit of medical supplies that Safiye had assembled with the focused precision of a woman who understood that every ounce of weight mattered, and that the supplies she brought might be the difference between life and death for the person she was going to treat. Tarhan looked at each member of the team in turn, and the look he gave them was not the look of a commander inspecting his troops, but the look of a man who is about to share a journey from which he may not return, a look that acknowledges the shared risk and the shared purpose, and the bond that forms between people who have agreed to face death together. He did not give a speech, because speeches are for men who need to be persuaded, and these men and women did not need persuasion. They needed only the signal to begin. He gave it a single nod, and the postern gate opened, and they passed through it one at a time, each figure emerging into the darkness beyond the wall and disappearing immediately into the deeper darkness of the terrain beyond, and the gate closed behind them, and the sound of its closing was the last sound of civilization they would hear for days. They moved west at a pace that was fast but sustainable, covering ground with the energy-efficient rhythm of people who understood that endurance was more important than speed, and that a team that arrives at its destination exhausted is a team that is already defeated. Tarhan set the pace, and Kerem, despite his fatigue, matched it without complaint, drawing on reserves of stamina that he had not known he possessed, because the drive to correct the failure of his previous mission was a fuel source that burned hotter and longer than any physical energy. By midday they had covered 20 miles and had passed beyond the last Ottoman outpost, a small watchtower manned by two soldiers whose eyes widened when they recognized Turhan, and whose questions were silenced by a single look that said, "Do not ask, do not tell anyone we were here, and forget you saw us." The soldiers nodded and watched the team pass, and then they returned to their post and resumed their watch, and the afternoon sun moved across the sky and the shadows lengthened and the team continued west, deeper into the no-man's land between the two empires, deeper into the territory where the rules changed and the protections disappeared, and the only law that applied was the law of strength and cunning, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to survive. They reached the hollow between the hills where Kerem had found the abandoned camp as the sun was setting, and Turhan examined the site with the thoroughness that had become his professional trademark, missing nothing, interpreting everything, building in his mind a reconstruction of the events that had taken place here that was as detailed and as accurate as a painting. He confirmed Kerem's assessment in every particular: the struggle, the blood, the drag marks, the departure to the west, and he added observations of his own that Kerem in his exhaustion and distress had missed: the number of horses, which indicated a party of at least 8 captors, the depth of the hoofprints, which suggested that the horses were carrying double loads, consistent with prisoners being mounted behind their captors rather than being forced to walk, and the spacing of the hoofprints, which indicated a pace of travel that was brisk but not panicked, the pace of a group that was confident in its mission and not expecting pursuit. Boren took over from here, his eyes dropping to the ground with the focused intensity of a man reading a book written in a language that only he understood, and he followed the trail out of the hollow and into the hills beyond, his pace slowing as the light faded but never stopping entirely, because Boren could track in conditions that would have been impossible for anyone else, reading the trail through touch when his eyes could no longer see, feeling the impressions in the earth with his fingertips, detecting the broken stems of grass and the displaced pebbles that marked the passage of horses over ground that was too hard for hoofprints. They followed the trail through the night, moving slowly, silently, the 5 of them strung out in a line with Boren at the front and Turhan at the rear, and the darkness around them was absolute, the moon hidden behind a thick layer of cloud that turned the sky into a featureless grey ceiling that seemed to press down upon the land, and the only sounds were the whisper of their footsteps and the distant, mournful cry of a wolf that was hunting somewhere in the hills to the north. A sound that was both beautiful and terrifying, the voice of a predator that had not yet found its prey, but was patient and persistent, and would not stop until it did. Dawn found them on a ridge overlooking a valley that none of them had ever seen before, a broad, fertile valley with a river running through its center and a village clustered on the riverbank, and beyond the village, set back from the road at the end of a lane lined with cypress trees, a compound of stone buildings surrounded by a wall that was too high for a farm and too low for a fortress. The kind of structure that is built by men who value privacy over defense, but who want enough of both to feel secure. Boren pointed to the compound and said that the trail ended there, that the horses had entered through a gate on the southern side and had not come out again, and the tracks were fresh enough that the arrival had been recent, perhaps the previous evening, perhaps earlier that day. Turhan studied the compound through the narrow space between 2 rocks, his body pressed flat against the cold ground, his breathing slow and controlled, and he counted the guards, 2 at the gate, 1 on the wall, and at least 3 more visible through the open windows of the main building, and he estimated the total occupying force at between 10 and 15. A significant number for a rescue team of 5, but not an insurmountable one if the approach was well planned and the execution was flawless. He pulled back from the observation point and gathered the team in a depression behind the ridge out of sight of the compound, and he laid out the plan with the quiet, precise authority that was his signature. They would wait until nightfall. They would approach from the north, where the wall was closest to a line of trees that would provide concealment during the approach. Orhan would go over the wall first, neutralizing the wall guards silently, and then opening the gate for the others. Boren would remain outside with the horses, providing a rally point for the withdrawal. Turhan, Kerem, and Safiye would enter the compound, locate a spotcher, and extract her, using force only when absolutely necessary, because noise was the enemy and speed was the ally. They spent the day resting in shifts, one always awake and watching the compound, monitoring the guard rotation, noting the patterns of movement inside and outside the walls, building the detailed tactical picture that would guide the operation when darkness fell. Safiye used the time to prepare her medical supplies, laying out bandages and salves, and the small sealed bottles of herbal compounds that she used for pain and fever and infection, and she arranged them in her bag with the careful organization of a woman who might need to find any item by touch, in darkness under pressure, with a patient's life depending on the speed and accuracy of her hands. The afternoon passed with the excruciating slowness that time adopts when you are waiting for something important, each minute stretching to fill the space normally occupied by 10, and the sun moved across the sky with the deliberate pace of an old man walking through a garden, pausing to examine each flower, each shadow, each cloud, before moving on to the next, and the team waited with the patience that is not passive but active. The patience of predators who have located their quarry and are now simply waiting for the conditions to shift in their favor. As the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, painting the valley below in shades of gold and amber and deep, bruised purple, Orhan made his final assessment and confirmed the plan, and the team prepared themselves with the ritualistic precision of people who understand that preparation is not just practical but psychological. That the act of checking weapons and tightening straps and adjusting equipment is also the act of focusing the mind and calming the nerves and transforming the raw energy of anticipation into the controlled, directed force that combat demands. The sun set and the darkness came, and with it came the silence that the team needed, the deep, enveloping silence of a rural valley at night, broken only by the occasional bark of a dog and the distant sound of the river moving over its stones, and the compound below them became a cluster of lights, the windows glowing with the warm orange of oil lamps, the gate torches casting pools of illumination that defined the boundaries of the guard's visual range, and by extension, the boundaries of the safe approach route that Orhan had identified during the day. They moved at midnight, descending from the ridge in single file, their black-smeared faces invisible against the dark hillside, their footsteps silent on the damp grass, their breathing shallow and controlled, 5 shadows moving through a world of shadows, indistinguishable from the darkness that surrounded them. Orhan peeled off at the base of the hill and took up his position with the horses, a quiet word of encouragement to each animal as he gathered the reins, and the remaining 4 continued toward the compound, angling north, using the tree line for cover, closing the distance between themselves and the wall with the steady, unhurried pace that avoids the sudden movements and the temporal urgency that attract attention. Orhan reached the wall first and pressed himself against it, his back flat against the cold stone, his head tilted back, listening for the footsteps of the wall guard above him. The guard passed overhead, his boots scraping on the stone walkway, and Orhan counted the seconds between his passes, timing the interval, calculating the window, and on the guard's 3rd pass. As he turned at the corner of the wall and began walking away, Orhan went up, his hands finding the rough stone with the sure grip of a man who had climbed walls in darkness more times than he could count, his body flowing upward with a fluid, almost liquid motion that made no sound. And he reached the top and rolled over it and landed in a crouch on the walkway, and the guard was 10 paces ahead, walking away, oblivious, and Orhan covered those 10 paces in the time it took to draw a breath, and his hand closed over the guard's mouth while his arm wrapped around the man's throat, and the guard struggled for 3 seconds and then went limp, unconscious but alive, and Orhan lowered him to the walkway and moved to the gate. The gate bar was heavy, a solid beam of oak that required 2 hands to lift, and the sound it made as Orhan raised it from its brackets was louder than he would have liked, a deep, woody groan that seemed to resonate through the entire compound, and he froze, holding the beam at an angle, listening for any response, any shout of alarm, any sound that would indicate that the noise had been heard and interpreted correctly. Nothing came. The compound slept on, its guards either inattentive or too far from the gate to have heard, and Orhan set the beam down carefully and pulled the gate open just wide enough for the others to pass through. Orhan entered first, followed by Kerem, followed by Safiye, and the 3 of them moved across the courtyard with the coordinated precision of a team that has rehearsed this movement in their minds so many times that the physical execution is almost automatic. The main building was directly ahead, a 2-story stone structure with a heavy wooden door and windows that were shuttered on the ground floor but open on the upper floor, where the faint glow of a lamp indicated that at least one person was awake. Orhan pointed to the door and then to Kerem, and Kerem moved to it and tested the latch, and the latch lifted, and the door opened, and the interior of the building was dark except for the faint light that filtered down from the upper floor, and the air inside was warm and heavy with the smell of cooking oil and sweat, and the indefinable but unmistakable smell of captivity, the smell of a space where people are kept against their will. A smell that is part fear and part despair, and part the bodily reality of confinement. They moved through the ground floor quickly and quietly, checking each room, finding sleeping guards in 2 of them, passing by without waking them, because the objective was not combat but extraction, and every guard left sleeping was a guard who would not be raising an alarm. They found a staircase and ascended, and the upper floor consisted of a single corridor with 4 doors, 3 of them closed, and one of them guarded by a man who was sitting in a chair with a sword across his knees, dozing but not deeply asleep, the kind of half-sleep that can be broken by any sound louder than a whisper. Orhan assessed the situation in the space of a heartbeat. The guarded door was almost certainly where a spotcher was being held, and the guard had to be eliminated before the door could be opened, and the elimination had to be silent, because the 3 closed doors might contain more guards or might contain nothing, and the uncertainty was a factor that could not be resolved without opening them, and opening them would take time that might not be available. He signaled to Kerem, and the 2 men moved forward together, their footsteps on the wooden floor producing no sound, because they were placing their feet on the edges of the boards where the wood was supported by the joists beneath, and was therefore less likely to flex and creak. A technique so basic that every scout learned it in their first week of training, but so effective that it remained relevant regardless of experience level. They reached the guard at the same moment, and Turhan's hand covered his mouth while Kerem's arm circled his throat, and the guard's eyes flew open and his hands reached for his sword. But the sword was across his knees and his knees were under the chair, and the chair was against the wall, and the geometry of his position made it impossible for him to draw the weapon before the pressure on his throat overcame his consciousness, and he slumped forward and was lowered to the floor with the careful, almost tender attention that professional soldiers give to enemies they have no personal quarrel with. Turhan tried the door, it was locked. He took the key from the guard's belt and turned it in the lock, and the mechanism clicked, and the door swung open, and the room beyond was small and bare and lit by a single oil lamp that burned on a shelf beside a narrow bed, and on the bed, curled into a position that was half sitting and half lying, her wrists bound in front of her with rope that had been tied so tightly that the skin beneath it was raw and discolored. Her face bearing a bruise on the left cheekbone that was dark enough to be visible even in the dim lamplight, her eyes wide and alert and burning, with a defiance that captivity had not diminished but had sharpened to a point, was a spotcher. She looked at Turhan, and for a moment she did not recognize him, because the charcoal on his face had transformed his familiar features into a mask that her exhausted mind could not immediately process. And in that moment, the moment before recognition, her body tensed with the anticipation of violence, the reflexive preparation for another blow, another interrogation, another demand for information that she had not given and would not give. And the fact that her first instinct was not to hope for rescue, but to prepare for abuse told Turhan everything he needed to know about what she had endured since her capture. And then recognition came, flooding her face with an expression that Turhan had never seen on any human being before and hoped never to see again. An expression that was part relief and part disbelief, and part the shattering of a wall that had been holding back emotions, so powerful that their release was almost violent, and her mouth opened but no sound came out, because the capacity for speech had been overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was feeling, and tears ran down her face. Over the bruise across the cracked lips and fell onto the rope that bound her wrists, and Turhan knelt beside the bed and cut the ropes with a single stroke of his knife, and the severed ends fell away, and a spotcher's hands, freed for the first time in days, rose to her face and covered it, and she wept silently the way captives weep, the way people who have learned that sound is dangerous weep. With their mouths closed, and their shoulders shaking, and their grief and their gratitude, and their rage all compressed into a silence that was louder than any cry. Safiye was beside her immediately, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over a spotcher's body, checking for injuries beyond the visible bruise, assessing the damage to her wrists, feeling for broken bones, looking into her eyes for signs of concussion. She found bruises on the arms and ribs, consistent with rough handling rather than systematic torture, and the wrist wounds, while painful, were superficial and would heal within a week. She applied a salve to the wrists, and wrapped them with clean bandages, and gave a spotcher a small drink from a bottle that contained an herbal compound, designed to reduce pain and promote calm, without inducing the drowsiness that would impair her ability to move. Turhan gave a spotcher 60 seconds, which was all he could afford, and then he touched her shoulder and said her name, and his voice was the voice of a man who has something important to say and very little time to say it. And he told her that they were leaving now immediately, and that she needed to stand and walk and keep walking until they were far from this place, and that everything else, the questions, the explanations, the accounting of what had happened and why and what it meant, all of that could wait until they were safe, and safe was not here, safe was east, safe was Bursa, safe was the city whose walls she had left a lifetime ago, or a few days ago, the difference between the two having become meaningless in the distorted timeline of captivity. As Spotcher stood, she stood on legs that were stiff from being bound and weak from inadequate food and trembling from the aftermath of sustained fear, but she stood, and the act of standing was itself a declaration, a refusal to remain in the posture of submission, a physical assertion of the autonomy that her captors had tried to take from her and had failed, because autonomy is not a matter of chains and locked doors, but of the spirit that inhabits the body, and a Spotcher's spirit, battered and bruised but unbroken, was standing now, and it would not sit down again. They left the room and moved down the corridor, past the unconscious guard, down the stairs, through the ground floor, across the courtyard, and through the gate where Orhan was waiting, his eyes scanning the darkness for threats, his hand on his sword, his body coiled with the readiness of a spring that is compressed and waiting for release. They passed through the gate and moved toward the tree line, and Boran was there with the horses, and they mounted, Ispocha riding behind Turhan on his horse because she did not have the strength to control a mount on her own, and they rode north, away from the compound, away from the valley, into the hills and the darkness and the cold night air that hit Ispocha's face like a slap and that she welcomed with every fiber of her being, because the cold was the cold of freedom and freedom. Even when it comes wrapped in cold and darkness, and the knowledge that the pursuit will begin at dawn, is the sweetest thing a human being can taste. They rode hard through the rest of the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the compound before the alarm was raised and the pursuit organized, and the terrain was difficult and the darkness was complete, and the horses were picking their way through rocky hillsides and across stream beds that were invisible until the animals were wadding through them. And Ispocha clung to Turhan's back and felt the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her and the solid warmth of the man in front of her, and the cold wind on her face and the bandages on her wrists, and the pendant-shaped absence at her throat where the necklace had been. And she did not know that the pendant was in Orhan's possession, in a war room in Bursa, lying on a map at the point where she had been taken, a golden eagle waiting for the woman who had worn it to come home and reclaim it. Dawn came, and with it the knowledge that the pursuit was now underway, because the compound's guards would have discovered the empty room and the unconscious sentries by now, and riders would have been dispatched in every direction, and the net that had been thrown would be tightening with every passing hour. Turhan pushed the pace, balancing the need for speed against the need to preserve the horses, and the team moved through the landscape with the focused, relentless energy of people who are racing against time, and who know that time is winning, but who refuse to concede the race. They rode east for 3 days, and during those 3 days, Ispocha began to speak. Not immediately, not all at once, but in fragments, in pieces that emerged during the brief rest stops and the long, silent hours in the saddle, pieces that Turhan collected and assembled in his mind the way an archaeologist assembles the shards of a broken vessel, each piece revealing a little more of the complete picture. She told him about the ambush, how they had stopped to rest in the hollow, how the attackers had come from the trees with the speed and coordination that indicated professional soldiers rather than bandits, how her escort had fought and been overwhelmed, how she had been seized and bound and thrown across a horse, and carried west at a pace that left no opportunity for escape. She told him about the interrogation, the questions about Orhan's military dispositions, the demands for information about the defenses of Bursa, the threats that had accompanied each question, and the increasingly violent consequences of her refusal to answer. She told him about the man who had led the interrogation, a Byzantine officer whose face she had recognized from her grandfather's court, a man who had once bowed to her and called her princess, and who now addressed her with contempt, and handled her with the casual brutality of a man whose conscience had been cauterized by loyalty to a master who demanded results and did not care how they were obtained. And she told him about the moment when she had understood, with a clarity that transcended fear, that she was not going to break, that the information they wanted was information she would carry to her grave if necessary, because the people it would endanger were people she had chosen, people who had chosen her, people whose trust was worth more than her comfort or her safety or her life, and this understanding, this absolute certainty of her own resolve, had transformed the interrogation from a contest of wills into a formality, because a person who has decided that death is preferable to betrayal is a person who cannot be broken, and the interrogator had sensed this, had seen it in her eyes, and had gradually shifted from questioning to waiting for instructions from his superiors about what to do with a captive who would not cooperate and who could not be released. Turhan listened to all of this, and he did not interrupt, and he did not comment, and the silence with which he received her account was not the silence of indifference, but the silence of a man who is honoring a testimony by giving it the space it deserves. And when she had finished, he said 2 words that contained within them everything that needed to be said. "You're safe." And Ispocha leaned her forehead against his back and closed her eyes, and the horse moved beneath them, steady and sure, carrying them east, carrying them home, and the landscape flowed past them like a dream, hills and valleys and forests and streams, the vast, indifferent, beautiful world that does not care about the struggles of the men and women who move through it, but that provides the stage upon which those struggles are enacted, and the story continued as it always continues. Carried forward by the will of those who refuse to let it end, who ride through the night and fight through the dawn and carry each other through the darkness when the darkness becomes too heavy to carry alone. And far behind them, in a compound in a valley, the alarm had been raised and the pursuit had been launched, but the pursuit was hours behind and miles away, and the distance was growing with every stride of Turhan's horse, and the gap between hunter and hunted was widening into a space that would eventually become too large to close, and the men who were chasing them would eventually understand this, would eventually realize that the prey had escaped, that the net had a hole in it. That the woman they had been holding was gone, carried away by shadows that had come from the east and dissolved into the night, and the realization would be bitter, and the consequences would be severe, and the Shahanshah would receive the news and would understand that Orhan Saheb was not just a military adversary, but something more, something harder to defeat and harder to contain. A man who kept his promises and honored his trusts, and sent his best warriors into the heart of enemy territory to rescue a single woman, not because she was strategically valuable, but because she was his, and what was his, he protected, with every resource at his disposal and every drop of blood in his veins. And the story went on. Because it must. Because it will. Because the arrow has left the bow, and the dawn is coming, and the walls of Bursa still stand, and the fires on those walls still burn, and the men and women who tend those fires still believe, with every breath they take and every prayer they whisper, that what they are building is worth building, and what they are defending is worth defending, and the world they are fighting for, a world of honor and faith, and the stubborn, magnificent, unbreakable human refusal to surrender, is a world that deserves to exist. And it will exist. Because they will make it so. The eastern horizon was still dark when Turhan's team crested the last ridge before the Ottoman frontier, and the sight that greeted them was not the welcoming glow of friendly fires, or the reassuring silhouette of a watchtower against the sky, but something far less comforting, the absolute emptiness of a landscape that had been deliberately cleared. The watchtower that should have been standing at the border crossing was gone, not destroyed but dismantled, its stones scattered across the hillside in a pattern that suggested methodical removal rather than violent demolition. And the absence of the tower was a message written in negative space, a declaration that the boundary between Ottoman and Byzantine territory had shifted, that ground Turhan had considered safe was no longer safe, and that the world they were riding back into had changed in the days since they had left it. He raised his hand and the team halted, the horses breathing hard from the sustained pace of the last 3 days, their flanks dark with sweat despite the cold air, their heads hanging with the heavy-necked exhaustion of animals that have given everything they have, and are running now on nothing but the instinct to keep moving because the rider on their back has not yet told them to stop. Ispocha was still behind him, her arms around his waist, her grip weaker than it had been when they left the compound, but still present, still holding, the physical manifestation of a will that refused to let go, even when the body it inhabited was screaming for rest. Turhan studied the dismantled watchtower and the terrain around it with the intense, methodical focus that had saved his life more times than he could count, and what he saw confirmed his worst suspicion. The ground around the tower's former position had been churned by hooves, many hooves, the deep parallel tracks of cavalry moving in formation, and the tracks led south, toward Bursa, and they were fresh, no more than a day old, the edges of the hoofprints still sharp and defined rather than softened by wind and rain. A significant cavalry force had passed through here recently, moving in the direction of the city he was trying to reach, and the dismantling of the watchtower suggested that whoever commanded this force wanted to move without being observed and reported. Boran dismounted and walked to the churned ground and knelt beside it with the absolute concentration that characterized his work, his fingers tracing the outlines of individual hoofprints, his nose close to the earth, reading the soil the way a scholar reads a manuscript, extracting meaning from details so subtle that they would have been invisible to anyone else. He stood after several minutes and reported to Turhan in the terse, technical language that trackers use when precision matters more than eloquence. The force that had passed through was large, at least 200 riders, possibly more, mounted on horses that were shod in the Byzantine style, with the distinctive crescent-shaped shoes that Byzantine farriers used. They were moving at a pace that suggested urgency but not panic, the steady canter of a force on a mission rather than the gallop of a force in pursuit or the walk of a force on routine patrol. And they had been accompanied by pack animals, mules based on the hoofprints, carrying supplies for an extended operation. Turhan processed this information against the backdrop of everything he knew about the strategic situation, and the picture that emerged was alarming. A Byzantine cavalry force of this size, moving south toward Bursa along a route that had been deliberately cleared of Ottoman observation posts, could only mean one thing. The Shahanshah had launched a flanking maneuver, sending a fast, mobile force around the northern end of the Ottoman defensive line to strike at Bursa from a direction that the city's defenses were not oriented to address. The western walls had been reinforced, the western approaches had been earthworked and staked and covered by archers, but the northern approaches had received less attention because the northern route was longer and more difficult, and had been considered an unlikely avenue of attack. This assumption was about to be proven wrong, and the consequences of being wrong about something this fundamental could be catastrophic. If 200 Byzantine cavalry reached Bursa's northern perimeter before the city was prepared to receive them, the attack would strike the weakest point of the defense at the worst possible moment, when the garrison was focused west and the Sultan's attention was divided between multiple crises. Tarhan made the decision instantly, with the speed that comes from years of operating in situations where hesitation is indistinguishable from failure. He turned to Kerem and told him to take the fastest horse and ride for Bursa, as though every demon in creation were on his heels, to reach the city before the Byzantine cavalry did, and to warn Orhan that the northern wall was about to be tested. Kerem did not argue, did not ask questions, did not waste a single second on anything that was not the act of mounting a fresh horse and pointing its head south and driving his heels into its flanks. He was gone in a moment, the drumbeat of hooves fading into the distance like the echo of a warning bell, and Tarhan watched him go and calculated the odds, the distance to Bursa, the speed of a single rider versus the speed of a cavalry column, the margin of time that separated warning from disaster. The margin was thin, perhaps an hour, perhaps less. Everything depended on how fast the Byzantine force was moving and how far ahead of Tarhan's position it had gotten, and these were variables that Tarhan could not determine with certainty, and the uncertainty gnawed at him with the relentless persistence of a rodent chewing through rope, weakening the fibers of his composure strand by strand. He turned to the rest of the team and told them what he had concluded, speaking quickly but clearly, because clarity in communication is the foundation of effective action, and a team that does not understand its situation cannot respond to it intelligently. He told them about the cavalry force, about its probable destination, about the threat it posed to the northern wall, and about the message he had sent with Kerem. And then he told them something that changed the nature of their mission from extraction to interdiction. They were not going to ride to Bursa. They were going to follow the Byzantine cavalry force and they were going to slow it down. 5 people against 200 horsemen, the arithmetic was absurd, the kind of calculation that appears in the stories of legends rather than in the plans of rational commanders, but Tarhan was not proposing a battle. He was proposing a delay, a harassment, a series of small, sharp, painful provocations that would force the cavalry commander to slow his pace, to tighten his formation, to assign scouts and flankers and rear guards, all of which would consume time, and time was the resource that Tarhan was trading in, buying minutes and hours with risk and audacity and the intimate knowledge of terrain that was the Ottoman warrior's greatest advantage. Orhan's face split into a grin that was equal parts admiration and disbelief, the grin of a man who recognizes insanity when he sees it, but who is too much of a warrior to let insanity pass without participating. Safiyai said nothing, but she checked the supplies in her medical bag with a thoroughness that suggested she was expecting to need them. Boran simply nodded and returned to his horse, because Boran was a man of action rather than reaction, and the action that had been proposed was clear enough to require no further discussion. Ispocha, who had listened to all of this from her position behind Tarhan, spoke for the first time in hours, and her voice was hoarse from disuse and rough from the cold and thin from exhaustion. But beneath the physical weakness, there was a core of steel that had been forged in the compound, where she had been held and tempered by the days of hard riding that had followed, and she said that she could ride. She said it simply, without elaboration, without drama, 3 words that were a statement of fact and a declaration of intent and a refusal to be treated as a liability. And Tarhan heard in those 3 words the echo of Orhan's assessment, that Ispocha was not merely a diplomatic asset but a person of extraordinary courage, and he adjusted his plan to accommodate her presence, giving her a horse of her own, one of the spare mounts that Boran had been leading. And trusting her to manage it despite her condition, because trust was what she had asked for, and trust was what she had earned. They rode south, following the tracks of the Byzantine cavalry, and the pace Tarhan set was fast enough to close the distance gradually without overtaking the force they were pursuing, because the objective was not to catch the cavalry, but to position themselves behind it in its blind spot, where they could strike without warning and withdraw before a response could be organized. The terrain favored this approach, the rolling hills and scattered forests of the northern borderland providing an abundance of concealment and a variety of attack positions that a small mobile force could exploit to devastating effect. They made first contact in the early afternoon, catching sight of the rear element of the Byzantine column as it crested a hill 2 miles ahead, a line of dark figures against the pale sky that appeared and disappeared as the column moved through the undulating terrain, visible for a moment on each hilltop, and then invisible again in each valley, like a serpent moving through tall grass, its body revealed in segments that hinted at the whole without ever showing it completely. Tarhan chose his moment with the patience and precision that had made him the most feared tactician in the Ottoman military. He identified a stretch of road that passed through a narrow defile between 2 rocky outcroppings, a natural bottleneck that would force the rear of the column to compress as it passed through, reducing the cavalry's ability to maneuver and creating a brief window of vulnerability that a small force could exploit. He positioned Orhan and Kerem on the eastern outcropping with bows, giving them an elevated firing position that commanded the road below and that was protected from counterfire by the rocky terrain. He positioned himself and Boran on the western side, with horses ready for a rapid withdrawal. Aspocha and Safai remained 200 yards behind, concealed in a dense stand of pine trees with the spare horses, ready to move when the withdrawal began. They waited. The column's rear guard approached the defile, a dozen riders moving in a loose formation that reflected confidence rather than caution, their attention focused forward on the column ahead rather than backward on the terrain behind, because the cavalry commander had not expected pursuit and had not prepared for it, and the men at the back of the column were the least experienced and the least alert. The ones who had drawn the rear guard assignment, because their commander considered them expendable, or because they had drawn the short straw. Orhan let the first 6 riders enter the defile, and then he gave the signal. 2 arrows flew simultaneously from the eastern outcropping, and both found their marks, one striking a horse in the hindquarters and causing it to rear and throw its rider, the other hitting a rider in the shoulder and knocking him sideways in the saddle. The effect was immediate and disproportionate to the actual damage inflicted. The remaining rear guard riders reacted with the instinctive panic of men who are being attacked from an unexpected direction, wheeling their horses, drawing their swords, shouting warnings to the column ahead, and the narrow confines of the defile amplified the chaos, the walls of rock reflecting and multiplying the shouts and the screams of the wounded horse until the sound was a continuous, disorienting roar that made it impossible to determine the direction of the attack or the number of attackers. Orhan and Boran added to the confusion by launching arrows from the western side, the projectiles crossing the defile at an angle that made it seem as though the attackers were everywhere at once, and the rear guard, caught between 2 fires in a space too narrow for effective cavalry maneuver, did the only thing they could do. They retreated forward, pushing into the column ahead of them, and the compression rippled through the formation like a shockwave, each element pushing the one ahead as the fear of attack from behind propagated through the ranks. The Byzantine commander, riding at the head of the column, received the report of the attack within minutes, and his response was exactly what Orhan had anticipated. He halted the column, deployed flanking scouts on both sides of the road, sent a platoon of his best riders back to investigate the defile, and reorganized the rear guard with more experienced men and stricter orders. All of these actions were militarily correct. All of them were exactly what a competent commander should do in response to an ambush, and all of them consumed time, precious, irreplaceable time, 20 minutes for the halt, 15 for the scout deployment, another 20 for the rear guard reorganization, nearly an hour of total delay created by 2 men with bows and a handful of arrows. By the time the column resumed its march, Orhan's team had already withdrawn from the defile and repositioned 2 miles further south, on the reverse slope of a hill that overlooked a river crossing where the road forded a shallow stream. The terrain here was different from the defile, more open, with fewer natural ambush positions, but Orhan was not looking for another ambush. He was looking for a different kind of delay, the delay that comes from uncertainty and the behavioral changes that uncertainty produces. He sent Boran across the river with a bag of caltrops, small 4-pointed iron spikes that were designed to be scattered on the ground with one point always facing upward, and that were the nightmare of cavalry commanders throughout the known world, because a horse that steps on a caltrop is a horse that goes lame, and a lame horse in the middle of a river crossing creates an obstruction that can paralyze an entire column. Boran scattered the caltrops across the ford with the methodical precision of a farmer sowing seed, each spike placed in the soft mud of the riverbed where it would be invisible beneath the shallow water, and then he withdrew to the far bank and rejoined the team. The effect of the caltrops was not immediate but cumulative. The first horse to step on one screamed and reared, dumping its rider into the cold water and causing the horses behind it to shy and balk. The second horse went down completely, its front legs buckling as both hooves found spikes simultaneously, and the rider was thrown forward over the animal's head and landed in the stream with a splash that sent water cascading over the soldiers behind him. By the time the third horse was hit, the entire ford was in chaos, horses refusing to enter the water, riders dismounting to lead their animals across on foot, the column backing up behind the crossing as the bottleneck grew wider and the delay grew longer. The Byzantine commander responded by sending engineers forward to clear the ford, and the engineers waded into the stream and began the painstaking process of locating and removing the caltrops by feel, working with their hands beneath the surface of the cold water, their fingers numb within minutes, their progress agonizingly slow because each caltrop had to be found individually in the mud and extracted without injuring the man who was extracting it. The process took over an hour, during which the column sat motionless on the north bank of the river, 200 horsemen and their mounts standing in the cold wind, watching the engineers work, feeling the time slip away like water through their fingers. Orhan did not attack during this delay. The temptation was enormous, 200 stationary cavalry packed into a confined space on the riverbank, the perfect target for a massed arrow attack, but the reality of 5 against 200 made such an attack suicidal, and Orhan's objective was delay, not destruction. Instead, he used the time to send a second rider, Orhan, on a flanking route that would bring him to Bursa by a different path than Kerem had taken, carrying a second warning message in case the first had not gotten through, because redundancy in critical communications was not paranoia but professional competence, and Orhan was nothing if not professionally competent. The team was now reduced to 4, Orhan, Ispocha and Safiye, and the reduction in numbers made further direct harassment increasingly dangerous, because each operation required at least 2 fighters at the point of contact, and at least 1 person managing the horses and the withdrawal route, and with only 4 people there was no reserve, no margin for error, no one to step in if someone was wounded or separated or simply too exhausted to continue. But Orhan was not done. He had one more trick to play, one more delay to create, and this one required not arrows or caltrops but something more fundamental, more primitive, more deeply rooted in the psychology of men at war. He needed fire. The column had finally crossed the river and was moving south again, its pace reduced by caution and its formation tightened by the awareness that enemies were operating in its rear, and the road ahead passed through a stretch of forest that was dense enough to create a canopy overhead and dry enough, despite the winter season, to burn. Orhan and Orhan worked quickly, gathering the dead wood and dry brush that littered the forest floor and piling it at intervals across the road, 3 separate barriers spaced 100 yards apart, each one soaked with the animal fat that Safiye carried in her medical supplies for the preparation of poultices, and that served equally well as an accelerant for fire. They lit the barriers as the first elements of the Byzantine column entered the forest, and the effect was everything Orhan had hoped for. The dry brush caught immediately, the animal fat producing a hot, intense flame that spread rapidly to the surrounding undergrowth and sent walls of fire across the road that were too wide to ride around and too hot to ride through. The smoke that billowed from the burning brush was thick and acrid, filling the forest canopy and reducing visibility to near zero, and the horses, already nervous from the day's events, reacted to the smoke and the heat with the primal terror that all animals feel in the presence of fire, rearing and plunging and refusing to advance regardless of their riders' commands. The column ground to a halt for the 3rd time that day, and the delay this time was the longest yet, because fire in a forest is not a problem that can be solved quickly. It must either be fought or waited out, and fighting it requires water and tools and manpower that were not readily available, and waiting it out requires patience, and patience was the one thing that the Byzantine commander was running out of. He sat on his horse at the edge of the burning stretch of road and stared at the flames, and felt the heat on his face and understood, with a clarity that was both infuriating and humbling, that he was being played, that a force so small that it was almost invisible was dictating the tempo of his advance, was choosing when and where he moved and when and where he stopped, was converting his numerical superiority into a liability by attacking not his strength but his schedule. Not his soldiers but his timeline. He sent riders west and east, looking for routes around the fire, and the riders found paths that were narrow and difficult but passable, and the column began the laborious process of diverting around the burning stretch of forest, each rider picking his way through terrain that was not designed for cavalry movement, the horses slipping on loose rock and stumbling over exposed roots and moving at a pace that was barely faster than a walk. And the detour added another hour to the journey and another layer of frustration to the column's collective mood. By the time the fire was behind them and the road was clear and the column was moving south again, the afternoon light was fading, and the commander was forced to make a decision that he did not want to make. He could continue through the night, pushing his exhausted horses and his demoralized men through darkness and unfamiliar terrain, arriving at Bursa in the pre-dawn hours but in no condition to fight. Or he could halt, make camp, rest his men and horses, and arrive at Bursa the following morning, fresh and ready for combat but a full day behind schedule. He chose to halt, because an army that arrives exhausted at the gates of a fortified city is an army that will be destroyed by the garrison before it can form a battle line, and a day's delay was preferable to annihilation. The decision was sound, militarily unassailable, and it was the decision that Orhan had been working towards since the moment he first saw the hoofprints at the dismantled watchtower, because every hour of delay was an hour of preparation for Bursa, an hour in which Kerem or Boran or both would reach the city and deliver the warning, an hour in which Orhan would redirect forces to the northern wall, an hour in which the trap that the Shahanshah had set would be recognized and countered. Orhan withdrew his reduced team to a safe distance from the Byzantine camp and allowed himself the first genuine rest in days, sitting on the cold ground with his back against a tree and his sword across his knees and his eyes half closed but never fully shut, the vigilance of a lifetime too deeply ingrained to be surrendered even in the grip of exhaustion. Ispocha sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket that Safiyai had insisted she use, and her face in the fading light was a study in contrasts, the bruise on her cheekbone dark against the pallor of her skin, the bandages on her wrists white against the brown of the blanket, and her eyes, those remarkable eyes that carried in them the history of two empires and the pain of a woman who had been torn between them, were open and clear, and focused on the middle distance with an intensity that suggested she was not looking at the landscape but through it, seeing something beyond the hills and the trees that was visible only to her. She spoke, and her voice was stronger than it had been that morning, the herbal compound and the hours in the saddle, and the simple act of being free having combined to restore some measure of her physical and psychological resilience. She told Orhan that during her captivity, during the hours when she had been bound and alone in the small room with the single lamp, she had thought about Orhan's words, the words he had spoken when he told her she was his Amana, and she said that she had not fully understood those words when he said them, had heard them as a formality, a courtesy, the kind of thing a powerful man says to a vulnerable woman to make her feel valued, but that in the silence of captivity, when every other comfort had been stripped away, those words had been the thing she held on to, the single fixed point in a universe of pain and uncertainty, and she had repeated them to herself like a prayer, like a mantra, like a spell that could ward off the darkness by the sheer force of its meaning. She said that she understood now what Amana truly meant, that it was not a word but a bond, not a courtesy but a covenant, and that the rescue, this impossible, reckless, magnificent rescue by 5 people who had ridden into enemy territory to bring her home, was the proof of that covenant, the evidence that the word was not empty but was backed by the full weight of everything Orhan Saheb was and everything he stood for. Orhan listened, and he did not respond with words, because words would have been inadequate and he knew it, and instead he simply sat beside her in the gathering darkness and shared the silence, and the silence was enough, it was more than enough, it was everything. Kerem reached Bursa 2 hours before sunset, his horse barely able to stand, its sides heaving with the desperate, labored breathing of an animal that has been pushed to the absolute limit of its endurance. He came through the western gate at a walk because the horse could no longer manage anything faster, and the guards who saw him recognized immediately from his appearance, the charcoal-smeared face, the wild eyes, the clothing stiff with dried sweat and dust, that this was not a routine arrival but an emergency, and they sent a runner to the palace before Kerem had even dismounted. Orhan received him in the war room, and Kerem delivered his message standing, because he was afraid that if he sat down, he would not be able to stand again. And the message was delivered in the clipped, urgent sentences of a man who understands that every second counts and that the economy of language is not a stylistic choice, but a tactical necessity. Byzantine cavalry, at least 200, approaching from the north, the watchtower at the border crossing dismantled, the force approximately 1 day's march from Bursa, Orhan engaging in delaying actions but with only 4 people, and Ispocha rescued alive in Orhan's care. Orhan absorbed this cascade of information with the stillness that was his signature response to crisis, the absolute immobility that preceded the explosion of decisive action, and the war room around him seemed to contract, the walls drawing in, the ceiling lowering, the space compressing to match the intensity of the moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who has assessed the situation and has already determined the response, and is now simply communicating it to the people who will execute it. He gave 4 orders in rapid succession. First, the northern wall was to be reinforced immediately, every available soldier not committed to the western defense redeployed to the northern perimeter, the signal fires along the northern chain lit as a warning to the outlying settlements, and the gate sealed and barricaded with the same thoroughness that had been applied to the western gates. Second, a message was to be sent to Evranosh, who was still operating in the field against the main Byzantine column, informing him of the flanking force and instructing him to detach a portion of his strike force to shadow the northern cavalry and continue Orhan's harassment if possible. Third, Jurkutai was to be contacted at Chanali and informed of the changed situation, because the arrival of a northern force altered the strategic calculus in ways that might require adjustments to the eastern deception. And fourth, Darsan was to be sent a message through Koroglu's network, because the Karasi conspiracy was now more urgent than ever, and the 10-day timeline that Darsan had established might need to be accelerated. The palace erupted into activity that made the previous day's preparations look leisurely by comparison. Soldiers ran through corridors and across courtyards, their armor clanking with the rhythmic urgency of a heartbeat accelerating under stress. Messengers mounted fresh horses and galloped out through the gates, carrying orders that would fan out across the territory like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Engineers who had been working on the western earthworks were redirected to the northern perimeter, their tools and materials loaded onto carts that clattered through the streets with a speed that sent pedestrians diving for doorways. And on the walls, the archers who had been stationed at the western corners were divided, half remaining to cover the western approach and half jogging along the ramparts to take up positions on the northern wall, their quivers full and their faces set with the grim determination of men who had been preparing for one threat and were now being asked to prepare for two simultaneously. Fatima heard the commotion from her quarters and went to the window, and what she saw, the soldiers running, the carts moving, the controlled chaos of a military establishment shifting its posture in response to a new threat, told her that something had changed, that the situation had deteriorated, that the walls she had been staring at for days were about to be tested in a way that no one had anticipated. She turned from the window and looked at the bow on the table and the quiver beside it, and she picked them up with the calm, purposeful movements of a woman who has made a decision and is acting on it, and she walked out of her quarters and through the corridors of the palace and into the courtyard, where the soldiers were assembling, and she took her place among them, bow in hand, quiver on her back, her wedding henna invisible beneath the leather glove that protected her drawing hand. No one questioned her presence, no one told her to go back to her quarters. The soldiers who saw her looked at the bow and recognized the quality of the weapon and the confidence of the woman who carried it, and they made room for her in their formation without comment, because in a city preparing for attack, the question of who fights is answered not by gender or station but by willingness. And Fatima's willingness was written in every line of her body, in the set of her jaw and the straightness of her spine and the steady, unwavering gaze that she directed toward the northern wall, where the threat was approaching and where she intended to meet it. Malhan Khatun saw her daughter cross the courtyard and said nothing. She stood at the window of her own quarters and watched Fatima walk toward the wall with the bow that her father had made for her, and the expression on Malhan's face was complex beyond any single emotion's ability to capture, pride and fear and love, and the aching recognition that the girl she had raised was now a woman who would choose her own battles and fight them on her own terms, and Malhan's hands gripped the windowsill with a force that whitened her knuckles. And she whispered a prayer that was too private for anyone else to hear, a prayer for strength, for her daughter, for her husband, for the city, for everyone who stood upon its walls and everyone who sheltered behind them, a prayer that encompassed the entire world because in this moment, this terrible, magnificent moment, the entire world had narrowed to the space within these walls and the people who would defend it. Night fell over Bursa with the finality of a curtain dropping on a stage, and the darkness was complete and heavy and filled with the sounds of a city girding itself for battle, the ring of hammers, the shouts of officers, the stamp of boots on stone, the creak of bows being strung and the rattle of arrows being sorted and counted and distributed, and the fires on the walls burned brighter than they had ever burned, fed by soldiers who understood that in the darkness, fire is both weapon and comfort, both defense and defiance, and the line of flames that encircled the city was a declaration visible for miles in every direction, a declaration that said, "We are here, we are ready, we are not afraid." And beyond the firelight, in the darkness that stretched from the walls to the horizon and beyond, the forces that had been set in motion continued their convergence, the Byzantine cavalry resting in its camp to the north, the Byzantine infantry advancing from the west, Turhan and his reduced team shadowing the northern force like wolves tracking a herd, Evranosh's strike force repositioning to address the new threat while maintaining pressure on the western column, Jerkutai's deception burning in the east. Darsan's conspiracy ripening in the Karasi territory, Bayram and Kemal working their quiet subversion inside the walls of Chanali, every element moving, every piece in play, the entire vast, complex, interconnected web of strategy and counter-strategy and human courage and human frailty drawing tighter and tighter around a single point, the city of Bursa, where a sultan stood at a map table and moved carved figures across painted terrain and saw in those figures not wood but lives. Not pieces but people, not a game but the most serious thing in the world. And in the darkness north of the city, still hours from safety, Turhan rode with Ispocha behind him and Orhan beside him and Safiye behind Orhan, 4 riders moving through the night, moving toward the fires that were visible now as a faint glow on the southern horizon, the glow of Bursa, the glow of home, and the glow grew brighter with each mile they covered, and the cold grew less bitter, and the darkness grew less absolute, and the horses, sensing the proximity of their stables and their feed, and the warmth that waited for them, quickened their pace without being urged. And Ispocha, looking over Turhan's shoulder at the distant glow, felt something rise in her chest that she had not felt since before her capture, something that was not quite hope and not quite joy but that contained elements of both, combined with a third element that was harder to name. An element that might be called belonging, the deep, quiet, bone-level recognition that the place she was riding toward was not just a destination but a home, not just a refuge but a community. Not just a city but a family, and that she was part of it, truly part of it, claimed and protected and valued, not for her bloodline or her political utility but for herself, for the woman she had chosen to become, and that this belonging, earned through suffering and tested by captivity and confirmed by rescue, was the most precious thing she had ever possessed. The glow of Bursa brightened on the horizon, and the riders pressed forward, and the night began its slow retreat before the approaching dawn, and the story continued as it must, as it will, as it always has, carried forward by the courage of the men and women who refuse to let it end, who ride through darkness toward light, who fight through fear toward faith, who carry each other when the burden becomes too heavy for one person to bear, and who build, stone by stone, prayer by prayer, sacrifice by sacrifice, the world that they believe in, the world that deserves to exist, the world that will exist because they will make it so. Because they have always made it so. Because that is what it means to follow Orhan Sahib. That is what it means to stand within these walls. That is what it means to be alive. The northern gate of Bursa opened in the grey hour before dawn, that liminal space between darkness and light when the world exists in a state of suspension, neither fully asleep nor fully awake, and the sound of the gate's iron hinges grinding against each other was the loudest sound in the city, a groan of metal that echoed off the stone walls and carried across the rooftops, and reached the ears of every sentry on every wall and every sleepless soul in every house, and the sound said something is happening. Something is changing, the boundary between inside and outside is being breached, and whether that breach brings salvation or destruction depends entirely on what passes through it. What passed through it was Orhan. He rode through the gate on a horse that was barely moving, the animal's head hanging so low that its muzzle nearly brushed the cobblestones, its legs trembling with each step, its sides caked with dried sweat and dust, and the residue of days of hard riding through terrain that would have broken a lesser animal long ago. Behind him, still clinging to his waist with hands that were bandaged and raw, her face a map of exhaustion and endurance and something fiercer than both, was a spotcher, and behind them came Orhan and Safiye on horses that were in equally desperate condition. 4 riders emerging from the darkness like survivors of a shipwreck washing up on shore, battered and diminished but alive, alive against all odds and all reason, alive because they had refused to accept any other outcome. The guards at the gate stared. They had been told to expect Orhan's return, had been briefed on the rescue mission, had been ordered to open the gate immediately upon his arrival regardless of the hour, but the briefing had not prepared them for the reality of what they were seeing. 4 people who looked like they had been dragged through the underworld and back, their faces black with charcoal and grime, their clothing torn and stained with substances that the guards did not want to identify. Their weapons still strapped to their bodies, but their bodies barely capable of supporting the weight. One guard stepped forward to help a spotcher dismount, and when she swung her leg over the horse's back and her feet touched the ground, her knees buckled and she would have fallen if the guard had not caught her. And the guard, a young man who had never spoken to a princess in his life, held her upright with the gentle, firm grip of someone handling something precious and fragile, and a spotcher leaned against him for a moment, just a moment, allowing herself the luxury of being supported by someone else's strength before summoning her own. Orhan did not dismount. He sat in the saddle and looked south toward the palace, and his face in the grey light was the face of a man who has been running on willpower for so long that the willpower itself has become a kind of exhaustion, a paradox of strength and weakness coexisting in the same body, and he turned his horse toward the palace without a word and rode, because his mission was not complete until he had delivered his report, and a report undelivered was a mission unfinished. And Orhan did not leave missions unfinished, not ever, not for any reason, not even for the overwhelming desire to fall from his saddle and lie on the cobblestones and close his eyes and sleep for a year. Orhan met him in the courtyard, not in the war room, not in the formal setting of maps and carved figures and candlelight, but in the open air under the grey sky, standing on the stones where the wedding guests had danced just days ago, days that felt like centuries, the celebratory banners long since taken down, but the memory of them still present in the faint stains on the walls where the dye had bled in the rain. The Sultan was dressed for battle, not ceremony, his armor buckled tight, his sword at his hip, his face bearing the particular expression that Orhan had seen only a handful of times in 20 years of service, the expression of a man who is holding too many things at once and who knows that if he sets any of them down, the others will fall. Orhan dismounted, and the act of swinging his leg over the horse's back required a conscious effort that would have been humiliating if anyone had been watching closely enough to notice, and he stood before Orhan and delivered his report in the terse, precise language that was his professional standard, each sentence a compressed packet of intelligence stripped of everything that was not essential. The rescue was successful. Ispocha was alive and would recover. The Byzantine flanking force was approximately 1 day north of the city, 200 cavalry, moving south along the cleared route, delayed by harassment operations that had cost them at least 4 to 5 hours, but that could not be sustained further due to the reduction of the team. The force was commanded by a competent officer who had adapted to the harassment by tightening his formation and deploying scouts, which meant that the element of surprise that had served the team so well during the first day of operations was now largely spent. Orhan listened without interrupting, and when Tarhan had finished, the Sultan did something that surprised everyone present, including Tarhan himself. He stepped forward and placed both hands on Tarhan's shoulders, and the gesture was not the formal acknowledgement of a commander receiving a report from a subordinate, but the intimate, personal gesture of a man expressing gratitude to someone he considers not just a soldier but a brother, and the weight of Orhan's hands on Tarhan's shoulders was simultaneously physical and emotional, heavy with the unspoken recognition that what Tarhan had done, the rescue, the harassment, the ride through enemy territory with an injured woman and a shrinking team, was the kind of action that transcends duty and enters the territory of devotion. Orhan said 2 words. He said the same 2 words that Tarhan had said to Ispocha in the darkness of the forest, and the repetition was not accidental but deliberate, a closing of a circle, a completion of a promise that had been made and kept, and that now stood as proof of everything the Ottoman cause represented. "You're safe." Tarhan's composure, which had held through days of danger and exhaustion and the crushing weight of responsibility, cracked for a moment, just a moment, a fissure so brief that only Orhan could have seen it, and then it closed again, and Tarhan straightened his back and nodded and asked what his next orders were, because that was who he was, a man who served, a man who asked what needed to be done and then did it, regardless of what it cost him, and the asking was itself a form of prayer. A submission to purpose that was as complete and as sincere as any worship offered in any mosque. Orhan told him to rest. He said it as an order, not a suggestion, because he knew that Tarhan would not rest voluntarily, that the man's sense of duty would drive him back to the walls before his body had recovered enough to be useful, and that an exhausted commander on the walls was worse than no commander at all, because his presence would provide false reassurance while his diminished capacity would compromise the decisions he made. Rest, Orhan said, and the word was spoken with an authority that allowed no argument and no appeal, and Tarhan accepted it with the disciplined obedience that was his deepest instinct, and walked toward his quarters on legs that were shaking with every step, but that carried him without faltering, because faltering was something Tarhan did not do, not in front of the Sultan, not in front of the soldiers, not in front of himself. Ispocha had been taken to the women's quarters by Safiyai, who had transitioned seamlessly from field medic to court healer, her demeanor shifting from the rough efficiency of emergency medicine to the gentler, more patient approach that was appropriate for a patient who was no longer in immediate danger, but who would need weeks of care to recover fully from the physical and psychological damage of captivity. She cleaned and rebandaged Ispocha's wrists, applied fresh salve to the bruise on her cheekbone, examined the bruises on her arms and ribs with hands that were firm but careful, and gave her a preparation of warm honey and herbs that would promote sleep without the disorienting grogginess that stronger compounds produced. Malhun Khatun arrived while Safiyai was working, and her presence in the room changed the atmosphere in the way that the presence of a matriarch always changes the atmosphere, adding a layer of authority and comfort, and the implicit assurance that whatever was wrong would be managed, that whatever was broken would be mended, that the household would absorb this crisis the way it had absorbed every previous crisis, through the collective strength of the women who sustained it. She did not fuss over Ispocha or overwhelm her with questions. She simply sat beside the bed and placed her hand over Ispocha's bandaged wrist and held it there, and the warmth of her hand and the steadiness of her presence were more effective than any medicine Safiyai could have administered, because the deepest wound of captivity is not physical but spiritual, the wound of isolation, the wound of being severed from the community of people who care about you, and the treatment for this wound is not herbs or bandages but the simple, powerful act of being present, of sitting beside someone and holding their hand and saying without words, "You are not alone, you were never alone, and you will never be alone again." Fatima came later, slipping into the room with the quiet footsteps of a woman who does not want to disturb a sleeping patient but who cannot stay away, and she stood at the foot of the bed and looked at Ispocha, at the bruises and the bandages, and the pale, exhausted face that was so different from the composed, dignified face she remembered from the wedding, and she felt a surge of emotion that was part anger and part tenderness. Anger at the men who had done this and tenderness for the woman who had endured it, and she set down the tray of food she had brought, bread and broth and dried fruit, and she sat beside Malhun and joined the silent vigil that the women of the household had established around the woman who had been returned to them. The morning advanced, and the grey light strengthened into the pale, diffused brightness of a winter day, and the city of Bursa continued its preparations with the relentless energy of a community that understands it is running out of time. The northern wall, which had been the least defended section of the perimeter, was being transformed at a pace that would have been impressive under normal circumstances, and was extraordinary given the constraints of time and resources. Soldiers who had been sleeping in the barracks, held in reserve for the western defense, were now on the northern ramparts, their bows strung, their arrows sorted, their positions assigned by officers who had studied the terrain beyond the wall and had identified the approaches that a cavalry force would most likely use, and the positions from which those approaches could be most effectively contested. The engineers who had built the western earthworks were now replicating their work on the northern side, though with less time and therefore less thoroughness, the ditches shallower, the stakes fewer, the berms lower, the work of days compressed into hours by the urgency of the threat and the tireless effort of men who dug and hammered, and carried earth until their hands were raw and their backs were screaming, and their minds were focused on nothing but the next shovelful, the next stake. The next yard of ditch that might be the difference between a wall that holds and a wall that breaks. Orhan was everywhere. He moved through the city with the kinetic energy of a man who has abandoned the luxury of delegation in favor of the direct, personal involvement that crisis demands, and his presence at each position, each work site, each guard post, was a jolt of motivation that sent fresh energy surging through tired limbs and flagging spirits. He inspected the northern wall and approved the placement of the archers, and suggested adjustments to the earthworks that reflected his own experience of defending against cavalry attacks, widening certain ditches to prevent horses from jumping across them, angling certain stakes to direct a charging horse into the path of the stake beside it, creating a cascade of obstacles that would break a cavalry charge into a collection of individual riders who could be picked off by archers firing from the elevated positions on the wall. He visited the western wall and confirmed that the defenses there were still adequate, that the reduction of forces to reinforce the north had not created vulnerabilities that the main Byzantine column could exploit, and he spoke with the officers who were holding the western line and told them that their job was the most important job in the city, because the western force was the main threat and everything else was a distraction. And a distraction that succeeds in pulling defenders away from the main threat has accomplished the enemy's objective without the enemy having to fight for it. He went to the armory and inspected the remaining supplies of arrows and found them adequate but not generous, and he ordered the fletchers to work through the night, producing additional shafts from the reserves of seasoned wood that had been stockpiled against exactly this kind of demand, and the fletchers bent to their work with the quiet, focused concentration of craftsmen who understood that each arrow they produced was a potential life saved or a potential enemy stopped. And the work of their hands was as much a contribution to the defense as the work of the soldiers on the walls. And he went to the mosque, not to pray, not in the formal sense, but to stand in the silence of the empty prayer hall and to feel the presence of something larger than himself, something that transcended the strategic calculations and the military preparations and the exhausting, relentless demands of leadership. And in that silence he found what he always found, not answers but clarity, not peace but purpose, the deep, sustaining certainty that the cause he served was worth the price it demanded. While Orhan moved through his city like the pulse that kept it alive, Evranosh received the message about the northern flanking force and made the adjustments that the new situation required. He detached Shamal and 10 riders from his strike force and sent them north with orders to find the Byzantine cavalry and to continue the harassment that Turhan had begun, using the same tactics of ambush, obstruction, and psychological pressure that had proven so effective during the previous day. The detachment reduced his western force to 30 riders, a number that was barely adequate for the continued harassment of the main column, but the alternative, allowing the northern force to approach Bursa unopposed, was unacceptable, and in warfare, every allocation of resources is a trade-off between competing needs, and the commander who cannot make these trade-offs quickly and decisively is a commander who will be overwhelmed by events. Shamal rode north with the eager intensity of a young warrior who has been given an independent command for the first time, and who intends to justify the trust that has been placed in him through the quality of his performance. He was not Turhan, did not possess Turhan's decades of experience or his encyclopedic knowledge of tactics, but he possessed something that was equally valuable in its own way, the raw, instinctive aggression of a man who has not yet learned to be cautious, who has not yet accumulated enough scars to make him conservative, and who approaches every engagement with the assumption that audacity will compensate for whatever he lacks in experience. His 10 riders were of similar temperament, young men chosen for their horsemanship and their willingness to take risks, and they moved north through the forests with the speed and the carelessness that youth confers, covering ground at a pace that would have made Turhan wince, but that brought them into contact with the Byzantine flanking force by mid-afternoon, far sooner than anyone had expected. Shamil found the cavalry column exactly where Turhan's intelligence had placed it, moving south along the cleared route, its formation tight and its scouts deployed, the commander clearly still wary from the previous day's experiences. But wariness and preparedness are not the same thing, and Shamil identified a vulnerability that the Byzantine commander had not addressed, a stretch of road that passed between a dense forest on the east and a steep ravine on the west, a natural choke point that compressed the column into a narrow file and made it impossible for the cavalry to deploy laterally in response to an attack. He positioned his riders in the forest on the eastern side and waited until the middle of the column was in the choke point, and then he struck, and the attack was nothing like Turhan's careful, calculated harassment. It was wild and fierce and loud, 11 riders erupting from the trees with swords drawn and war cries that split the afternoon air like thunder, and they crashed into the side of the column with a force that was disproportionate to their numbers, because the shock of a sudden attack in a confined space multiplies the impact of each attacker by a factor that is difficult to calculate but impossible to ignore. The Byzantine cavalry reacted with the trained discipline of professional soldiers, but the choke point worked against them, their horses jostling each other in the narrow space, their lances too long to be used effectively at close range, their numerical advantage negated by the terrain that prevented them from bringing more than a handful of riders to bear at any one point. Shamil and his men fought with the savage joy of warriors who have found their element, their shorter swords and lighter armor giving them an advantage in the close, chaotic fighting that the choke point produced, and they struck and withdrew and struck again, each attack from a slightly different angle, each withdrawal followed by a repositioning that kept the Byzantine commander guessing about the direction of the next assault. The engagement lasted 20 minutes, and when Shamil finally withdrew his force into the trees, the damage he had inflicted was significant, not in terms of casualties, though several Byzantine riders had been unhorsed and at least 2 were wounded seriously enough to require attention, but in terms of the psychological impact, which was devastating. The column halted again, the commander reorganizing his formation and deploying additional scouts, and spending the time and energy that he could not afford to spend, and the delay, added to the delays that Turhan had already created, pushed the arrival at Bursa back by another several hours. Shamil lost 1 rider in the engagement, a young man named Ferhat who had been pulled from his saddle by a Byzantine lancer, and who had fallen beneath the hooves of the surrounding horses and had not risen. And Shamil felt the loss with the sharp, specific pain that comes from losing someone you know personally, someone whose face you can picture, and whose voice you can hear, and whose family you will have to face when the fighting is over, and the pain did not diminish his determination but sharpened it. Gave it an edge that was both dangerous and useful, because a commander who has lost a man fights differently from a commander who has not, fights harder and more ruthlessly, and with a focused, burning intensity that the enemy can feel even at a distance. He pulled his remaining 9 riders back to a safe distance and waited for the column to resume its march, and when it did, he was ready, and the next harassment was already planned, and the next one after that, and the pattern of strike and delay and strike again continued through the afternoon and into the evening, each engagement a small, sharp, painful reminder to the Byzantine commander that the road to Bursa was not a highway but a gauntlet, and that every mile had a price. And the price was being collected with interest. Back in the city, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, and the northern defences took shape under the tireless direction of the engineers and the newly assigned officers, a different kind of development was unfolding in the war room, where Orhan had reconvened his inner council to assess the overall situation and to make decisions that could no longer be postponed. The council was smaller than it had been at the original meeting. Turhan was sleeping under orders, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion that his will had held at bay for days. Evranosh was in the field, Darsan was in the Karasi territory, Jerkutai was maintaining the deception at Chanali. The men who gathered around the map table were the ones who remained, the garrison commanders and the senior officers who had been managing the city's defense, while the Sultan's strategic vision played out across the wider stage. Orhan laid out the situation with the characteristic clarity that made his war councils models of efficient communication. The western threat was being managed, the Byzantine main column slowed by Evranosh's harassment, but still advancing, still dangerous, still the primary threat to the city. The northern threat was new and serious, a flanking force that would arrive within 24 hours, and that would test a section of the wall that was less prepared than the western defenses. The eastern situation was stable, Jerkutai's deception still holding at Chanali, but the deception had a finite lifespan and would eventually be discovered, and when it was, the garrison at Chanali would be free to redeploy, potentially adding its strength to either the western or the northern attack. And the Karasi situation was promising but unresolved, Darsan's conspiracy growing but not yet ready to produce concrete military results. The arithmetic was stark. Bursa was facing a combined force of approximately 4,000 infantry and 200 cavalry from two directions, with its own garrison of approximately 1,500 defenders, augmented by civilian volunteers, whose courage was admirable but whose military training was minimal. The walls were strong, the defences well planned, the morale of the garrison high, but the numbers did not lie, and the numbers said that a sustained assault from two directions simultaneously would stretch the defence to its breaking point. Orhan did not present this arithmetic as a problem without a solution. He presented it as a challenge that required a specific response, and the response he proposed was the one that he had been considering since the moment he received Kerem's warning about the northern force, a response that was bold and risky, and that drew on the same principle that had governed his strategy from the beginning. The principle that a smaller force can defeat a larger one by refusing to fight on the larger force's terms, and instead creating the conditions under which the smaller force's advantages become decisive. He proposed to let the northern force reach the wall. The words produced a silence in the war room that was so complete it seemed to absorb all sound, not just the voices of the men present but the ambient noise of the city itself, the hammering and the shouting and the clatter of preparations, all of it suspended in the vacuum created by a statement that seemed, on its face, to be an admission of defeat rather than a strategy for victory. But Orhan was not finished. He explained that the northern force was cavalry, and cavalry, for all its speed and mobility and shock value, had a fundamental weakness when used against fortified positions. Cavalry cannot breach walls, cavalry cannot climb ladders, cavalry cannot sustain a siege. Cavalry is designed for open field combat, for flanking maneuvers, for the pursuit of a retreating enemy, and when it is deployed against a walled city, its options are limited to dismounting and fighting on foot, which negates its primary advantage, or riding back and forth outside the walls looking for an opening that does not exist, which is a waste of time and energy that degrades the force's effectiveness with each passing hour. The northern force had been sent to create a second front, to divide the defenders' attention, and to stretch the garrison across two walls instead of one. But if the northern wall was properly prepared, if the defences that were being constructed could hold against a dismounted cavalry assault, which they could because dismounted cavalrymen are inferior infantry, then the northern force would accomplish nothing except to commit itself to a fight it could not win. Tying down 200 men in a futile assault, while the main column continued its approach from the west. And this was where the opportunity lay. If the northern force could be fixed against the northern wall, committed to an assault that it could not break off without admitting failure, then it would be unable to reinforce the western attack or to maneuver around the city to join forces with the main column, and the Byzantine commander's strategy of a coordinated two-pronged assault would collapse into two separate, uncoordinated attacks, each of which could be dealt with independently. But Orhan continued, there was a further opportunity, one that required a degree of risk that he was not willing to accept without the explicit agreement of every man in the room. If the northern force was committed to its assault, if its commander was fully engaged and his attention was focused on the wall in front of him, then a force could sally from the eastern gate, a force large enough and fast enough to strike the northern cavalry from behind while it was occupied with the wall, catching it between the defenders above and the attackers below, a hammer and anvil that would crush the flanking force and eliminate the northern threat entirely. This sally would require men who could not be spared from the western defense without creating the vulnerability that the Shahanshah was hoping to exploit, and the question that Orhan was putting to his council was not whether the plan was sound, because the plan was sound, he had built it with the same care and precision that he brought to everything, but whether the risk was acceptable. Whether the temporary weakening of the western wall for the duration of the sally was a price worth paying for the potential elimination of the northern threat. The debate that followed was the kind of debate that only occurs in councils where disagreement is not merely tolerated but expected, where the quality of the decision is determined by the rigor of the process that produces it, and every man in the room understood that Orhan's willingness to be challenged was not a sign of weakness, but a demonstration of the confidence that comes from knowing that your plan can withstand scrutiny. Voices were raised, objections were articulated, counter-arguments were presented, and the map table became a battlefield of ideas where strategies clashed and were tested and were refined by the impact. In the end, the council agreed. The plan would proceed, the northern wall would hold, the sally would be prepared. And the timing of everything, the arrival of the northern force, the engagement at the wall, the sally from the eastern gate, would be coordinated with the precision of a clockwork mechanism, each element dependent on every other element, each failure point capable of bringing the entire structure crashing down, and the margin for error was not slim but non-existent. Orhan dismissed the council and stood alone at the map table, and the carved figures stared up at him with their blank, expressionless faces, and he moved them into their new positions, the northern force approaching the northern wall, the sally force assembled behind the eastern gate, the western defenders holding their line, and the pattern they formed was intricate and dangerous and beautiful in the way that all great strategies are beautiful. The beauty of human intelligence applied to the problem of human survival, the beauty of a mind that can see 3 moves ahead in a game where each move is played with lives. He touched Espotcha's pendant, which still lay on the map at the point where she had been taken, and he picked it up and held it in his palm, and the gold was warm from the candle's heat, and the eagle's 2 heads looked east and west, toward the 2 empires that were locked in a struggle that had lasted for generations and that would continue for generations more, and Orhan closed his fingers around the pendant and felt its edges press into his skin. And he made a silent promise that the pendant would be returned to its owner, that Espotcha would stand in this room again and reclaim the symbol of her heritage, and that when she did, she would be standing in a city that had not fallen, among people who had not surrendered, under a banner that had not been lowered. He pocketed the pendant and extinguished the candle, and the war room was plunged into darkness, and in that darkness, the carved figures on the map stood in their positions and waited for the dawn that would set them in motion, and the silence was the silence of a held breath, the silence before the storm, the silence that contains within it all the noise that is about to be released. And outside, the city breathed its shallow, quick, anticipatory breaths, and the fires on the walls burned against the darkness, and the soldiers walked their posts with their hands on their weapons and their eyes on the horizon, and somewhere to the north, a cavalry force moved through the night toward them, and somewhere to the west, an infantry column advanced toward them, and somewhere to the east. A deception burned, and a conspiracy ripened, and a future took shape in the minds of men who were willing to risk everything for the chance to make it real. And somewhere in between all of these points, in the spaces between the armies and the walls and the fires and the darkness, the story of Orhan Saheb continued its relentless, magnificent, terrible unfolding, each moment leading to the next, each decision producing consequences that could not be undone, each heartbeat carrying the weight of 1,000 lives and 1,000 deaths and the 1,000 choices that would determine which was which. And the dawn was coming. And when it came, the world would change. And the men and women who stood upon the walls of Bursa, who held their bows and their swords and their prayers and their fears in hands that trembled but did not let go, would face that change together, as they had always faced everything together, with the courage that is not the absence of fear but the mastery of it, with the faith that is not the absence of doubt but the transcendence of it, with the love that is not the absence of loss but the defiance of it. And they would not break. They would not fall. They would not surrender. Because they were Ottoman. Because they were Orhan Saheb's people. Because the story does not end here. It continues. It always continues.